The entire ballroom fell silent when Isabella Hart saw the photograph. Not because the image was shocking to anyone else, because she was the only person in the room who wasn't supposed to see it. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, what would you do if you discovered your fiancé was secretly living a double life just days before your wedding? The charity gala at the Grand Meridian Hotel was supposed to be one of the happiest nights of Isabella's life. Instead, it became the night everything shattered. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen stars. Wealthy business leaders, celebrities, politicians, and socialites filled the enormous ballroom. Expensive champagne flowed freely. A live orchestra played softly in the background. Everywhere Isabella looked, people smiled at her. The future Mrs. Victor Langford. The beautiful billionaire heiress. The woman who seemed to have everything. They had no idea her world was about to collapse. At 30 years old, Isabella Hart had spent her entire life under public scrutiny. As the only daughter of Richard and Eleanor Hart, she had grown up surrounded by wealth, expectations, and endless responsibilities. Nothing in her life had ever been simple, even love. Especially love. 3 years earlier, Victor Langford had entered her life like a perfect dream. He was handsome, successful, charming, confident. Everything society expected her future husband to be. When he proposed on a private yacht surrounded by family and friends, newspapers across the country covered the story. The wedding had already been labeled the social event of the year, and it was only 6 days away. 6 days. The thought made Isabella smile as she greeted another guest. Everything was finally coming together. Or so she believed. Across the ballroom, Ethan Cole stood quietly near the entrance. Most people never noticed him. That was the nature of his job. Drivers were supposed to be invisible. Present but unseen. Important but ignored. For 4 years Ethan had worked for the Hart family. He drove Isabella to meetings, to charity events, to corporate conferences, to family gatherings. He knew her schedule better than almost anyone. Yet despite spending countless hours around her, he rarely spoke unless spoken to. He understood boundaries. He understood his place. Tonight he wore a simple black suit and stood near the wall while security personnel monitored the event. His attention remained on Isabella. Not because he had feelings for her. Not because he wanted anything from her. Because something felt wrong. Very wrong. He couldn't explain it. But Victor had been acting strangely all evening. The businessman kept disappearing, leaving conversations abruptly, checking his phone repeatedly, looking nervous. And Victor Langford was not a nervous man. Ethan noticed details. It was one of the reasons he was good at his job. His instincts rarely failed him. Unfortunately, neither did they tonight. Near the center of the ballroom, Isabella laughed politely at a joke from one of her father's business associates. Then her phone vibrated, a text message. Unknown number. She almost ignored it. Almost. But something made her look. 3 words appeared on the screen. Check your email. Nothing else. No explanation. No name. Just those words. A small frown crossed Isabella's face. She opened her email. At first she thought it was spam. Then she saw the attachment. A photograph. Her stomach tightened. Slowly she opened it. The moment the image appeared, her entire body froze. Victor and another woman, kissing. Not at a restaurant. Not at a party. Inside what appeared to be an apartment. The date stamp on the image had been taken 3 days ago. 3 days. Only 3 days ago. Her heartbeat accelerated. No. There had to be some explanation. Some misunderstanding. Maybe the image was fake. Maybe someone was trying to sabotage the wedding. Her fingers trembled as she opened the next attachment. Another photograph. Victor entering a luxury apartment building. Holding hands with the same woman. The third image was worse. Far worse. Victor and the woman embracing on a balcony. The intimacy between them impossible to deny. The world around Isabella seemed to fade away. The music disappeared. The conversations vanished. All she could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat. Then came the final attachment. A video. 30 seconds long. She pressed play. Victor's voice filled the screen. Clear. Undeniable. I'll end things after the wedding. Isabella stopped breathing. The woman laughed. Victor smiled. Then he kissed her. The video ended. Everything inside Isabella shattered. Not because Victor had cheated. Although that hurt. Not because he had lied. Although that hurt even more. It was the casual cruelty. The certainty. The confidence that she would never discover the truth. 3 years. 3 years together. 3 years of trust. 3 years of promises. And all of it had been a lie. A carefully constructed lie. Across the ballroom, Ethan noticed the color drain from Isabella's face. Something had happened. Something serious. Without hesitation, he moved closer. Not enough to attract attention. Just enough to help if needed. Meanwhile, Isabella opened the email again. There was one final message. If you don't believe me, check the East Terrace. No signature. No explanation. Just instructions. She should have ignored it. She should have walked away. Instead, she found herself moving. One step. Then another. Then another. Toward the East Terrace. The massive ballroom suddenly felt suffocating. Guests continued smiling, talking, laughing, completely unaware that her life was falling apart. As Isabella approached the terrace doors, a terrible feeling settled in her chest. She already knew what she would find. She just didn't want to admit it. The terrace overlooked the city skyline. Normally, it was one of her favorite places in the hotel. Tonight, it became a nightmare. The moment she stepped outside, she heard voices. Victor's voice. And a woman's. She froze, hidden behind a stone column. Listening. Just a few more days. Victor said. The woman laughed softly. You really plan to marry her? It's business. Business. The word struck Isabella harder than any physical blow. Business. Not love. Not commitment. Business. Her family controls half the projects I need. Victor continued. Once we're married, everything becomes easier. The woman moved closer to him. And after? Victor shrugged. After? We'll see. They kissed. Right there. On the terrace. Only a few feet away. No misunderstanding, no mistake, no explanation. The truth stood before her in brutal clarity. The man she loved was using her. The man she planned to marry was betraying her. The man she trusted was laughing behind her back. For several seconds, Isabella couldn't move. Couldn't think. Couldn't breathe. Then something inside her changed. The sadness remained. The heartbreak remained. But another emotion began replacing them. Anger. Cold. Sharp. Dangerous anger. Victor suddenly looked toward the doors. For a moment, Isabella considered confronting him, exposing him immediately, creating a scandal, making a scene. But then she stopped. No, that would give him control. That would let him decide how this story ended. Instead, she stepped away quietly, unseen, unnoticed, returning to the ballroom. Every step felt different now. The woman who entered the terrace wasn't the same woman leaving it. The illusion was gone. The dream was dead. Only reality remained. As she walked through the crowd, Ethan saw her expression and immediately knew something terrible had happened. Not sadness, not disappointment, something much deeper, something dangerous. Their eyes met briefly. For the first time in 4 years, Ethan saw genuine fury in Isabella Hart's eyes. The kind of fury capable of changing lives. The kind of fury capable of destroying people. Across the ballroom, Victor returned from the terrace, smiling, laughing, shaking hands, playing the role of devoted fiancé perfectly. Everyone believed him, everyone except Isabella. And now she knew the truth. The wedding was 6 days away. Victor thought he had won. He thought Isabella would never discover his secret. He thought she would walk down the aisle exactly as planned. He had no idea what was coming. No idea that tonight had changed everything. No idea that the greatest mistake of his life wasn't cheating. It was underestimating the woman he betrayed. as the orchestra continued playing and wealthy guests celebrated around them. Isabella raised a glass of champagne. A calm smile appeared on her face. Anyone watching would assume nothing was wrong. But beneath that smile, a storm was gathering. A storm powerful enough to destroy futures. And before it was over, one quiet driver standing across the ballroom would become the most important person in her life. The game had begun. Victor simply didn't know it yet. The next morning, every newspaper in the city carried photographs of Isabella Hart and Victor Langford smiling together at the charity gala. The images made her sick. She sat alone in the breakfast room of her mansion, staring at a front-page headline celebrating their upcoming wedding. The perfect power couple. The words felt like a cruel joke. Victor had called 3 times since sunrise. She ignored every call. Then came the messages. Good morning. Beautiful. Busy day ahead. Can't wait to marry you. Each message felt like poison. The fact that he could lie so easily disturbed her more than the betrayal itself. 3 years. 3 years together. Had any of it been real, or had she simply been another business opportunity? The answer no longer mattered. The only thing that mattered was what happened next. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Miss Hart. It was Ethan. She looked up. Come in. Ethan entered carrying her schedule for the day. As always, he appeared calm and professional. Dark suit. Straight posture. No unnecessary conversation. For years he had been one of the few constants in her life. Reliable. Steady. Predictable. Something she suddenly valued more than ever. You have a meeting with the board at 10, Ethan said. Then lunch with the development partners. Isabella nodded. Cancel lunch. Yes. Cancel the afternoon meetings too. Yes. Ethan paused. Are you feeling all right? Normally he wouldn't ask. Normally he kept his distance. But Isabella looked exhausted. As if she hadn't slept. Which was true. She hadn't slept at all. For hours she had replayed Victor's words from the terrace. It's business. The phrase echoed endlessly inside her head. I'm fine, she said. Ethan didn't believe her. But he also knew better than to push. Your car will be ready whenever you need it. As he turned to leave, Isabella stopped him. Ethan. He looked back. Yes. She studied him. For the first time in years, she truly looked at him. Not as an employee. Not as a driver. As a person. A man. Someone who had spent years around her without ever asking for anything. Someone who had never lied to her. Never manipulated her. Never betrayed her. The contrast with Victor was impossible to ignore. What do you think about trust? She asked. Ethan blinked. The question surprised him. Trust. Yes. He considered his answer carefully. It's difficult to earn, and easy to lose. A bitter smile crossed Isabella's face. That's true. Ethan hesitated. Did something happen? For several seconds she remained silent. Then she shook her head. Nothing I can't handle? Ethan wasn't convinced. But once again he respected her boundaries. I'll be downstairs. After he left, Isabella stared out the window. The massive estate stretched across perfectly landscaped grounds. Everything looked beautiful, perfect, ordered. Yet chaos consumed her mind. Around noon, Victor finally appeared in person. Without warning, without invitation, the mansion staff informed her that he was waiting in the main living room. Isabella took a deep breath. Time to perform. When she entered the room, Victor smiled. The same smile she had once loved. Now she saw it differently. Now she saw calculation, manipulation, self-interest. Hey! He walked toward her, attempting to kiss her. Isabella turned slightly. The kiss landed on her cheek. Victor frowned. Everything okay? The irony almost made her laugh. Why wouldn't it be? He relaxed, clearly satisfied, because he believed she knew nothing. I'm just stressed about the wedding. Aren't we all? He joked. The wedding. The word sounded absurd now. Victor spent the next hour discussing decorations, guest lists, and honeymoon plans. All while maintaining the charade. all while pretending to love her. The performance was impressive. If Isabella hadn't seen the truth herself, she would have believed him. Eventually, Victor left. The moment the front doors closed, Isabella felt exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. Pretending was harder than she expected. But she wasn't ready to reveal her hand. Not yet. She needed time. She needed a plan. And most importantly, she needed revenge. Not childish revenge. Not screaming. Not public meltdowns. Something smarter. Something unforgettable. Something that would hurt Victor the same way he had hurt her. The idea began forming later that evening. Small at first. Just a thought. A possibility. A dangerous possibility. The Hart family hosted a pre-wedding dinner that night. Close friends, business partners, relatives. Dozens of wealthy guests filled the mansion. Victor arrived wearing a custom suit. Sophia was nowhere in sight. Of course she wasn't. The secret had to remain hidden. At least for now. Isabella spent the evening smiling politely, playing her role, watching Victor, studying him. The more she observed, the angrier she became. He looked so comfortable, so confident, as if the future belonged to him, as if there would be no consequences. Then something unexpected happened. One of the guests made a joke. A wealthy investor named Gerald Mason laughed loudly. "You know what I admire most about Victor?" Several guests looked toward him. "What?" Gerald grinned. "The man won the lottery." Laughter spread across the room. Victor chuckled. Isabella remained expressionless. Gerald continued. "Let's be honest, marrying Isabella is the best business deal anyone could make." More laughter. Even Victor smiled. That was the moment something clicked. Business deal. The same words. The same attitude. The same arrogance. To them, marriage was a transaction. A merger. A contract. Nothing more. Suddenly Isabella saw everything clearly. Not just Victor. The entire social circle. The entire world she had grown up in. They all believed status determined value. Money determined worth. Titles determined importance. Which meant there was one thing none of them would ever expect. A man without status. A man without wealth. A man they considered invisible. Her gaze drifted across the room. Toward Ethan. As usual, he stood quietly near the entrance. Watching. Listening. Doing his job. Completely unaware that he had just become part of a very dangerous idea. Hours later, after the guests departed, Isabella found herself unable to sleep again. The idea refused to leave her mind. The more she considered it, the more powerful it became. By midnight, she was pacing through the mansion library. Thinking. Planning. Imagining Victor's reaction. Imagining society's reaction. Imagining headlines. Then she heard footsteps. Ethan. He was conducting a final security check before leaving for the night. When he noticed Isabella still awake, he stopped. "You should get some rest." She laughed softly. "Probably." Neither spoke for several seconds. The silence felt strangely comfortable. Finally, Ethan turned to leave. Then Isabella said it. Without planning. Without warning. Without giving herself time to reconsider. "Ethan." He stopped. Yes. Her heart pounded. The words sounded insane. Absolutely insane. Yet she couldn't stop them. "What would you say if I asked you to marry me?" Silence. Complete silence. Ethan stared at her, certain he had misunderstood. "I'm sorry." Isabella looked directly into his eyes. No hesitation. No retreat. "What would you say if I asked you to marry me?" For several moments Ethan simply stood there, unable to process what he had heard. This wasn't a joke. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't laughing. She was completely serious. "Miss Hart." "Isabella." "What?" "Call me Isabella." His confusion deepened. "Isabella? Why would you ask me that?" She took a deep breath. Because now there was no going back. The words finally emerged. "My fiancé is cheating on me." Ethan froze. "What?" "I found out last night." For the first time, genuine emotion crossed Ethan's face. Shock. Anger. Concern. "I didn't know. Nobody does." She walked toward the window, looking out into the darkness. "He thinks I'm going to marry him anyway?" You're not. No, Bo. The answer came instantly. Certain. Final. Ethan nodded slowly. That part made sense. But not the rest. What does that have to do with me? Isabella turned. A strange mixture of heartbreak and determination filled her eyes. Because I want him to regret everything. Ethan immediately understood. And that understanding terrified him. No. The answer came before she even finished speaking. No. This is a bad idea. She almost smiled. Probably a terrible idea. Maybe. Possibly the worst idea I've ever heard. That actually made her laugh. The first genuine laugh she'd had in 2 days. But the amusement quickly faded. I'm serious. So am I. Ethan stepped forward. You don't make life. Changing decisions when you're angry. Maybe not. Don't. She looked at him carefully. Would you have said yes if I wasn't angry? The question caught him completely off guard. For several seconds he couldn't answer. And that silence told Isabella everything. Not because he loved her. Not because he wanted her. But because he was actually considering the question. That alone surprised her. Finally Ethan exhaled. This conversation has become dangerous. A faint smile touched Isabella's lips. That's because it is. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the mansion windows. Neither of them realized it yet. But the future had just changed. A single impulsive question had set events into motion that neither could control. And before the week ended, all of society would be talking about one impossible marriage. A billionaire heiress and her driver. 3 days later, the city exploded with rumors. Nobody knew exactly what had happened. But everyone knew something had. Victor Langford's wedding to Isabella Hart was only 3 days away. Yet invitations were suddenly being revised. Schedules were changing. And whispers were spreading through every business circle in the city. The social elite loved gossip, and nothing generated gossip faster than uncertainty. Meanwhile, inside Hart Manor, Isabella sat across from Ethan in the private library. The same room where everything had begun. The same room where she had made the most reckless proposal of her life. For 2 days Ethan had refused to discuss it. For 2 days he had attempted to convince her to reconsider. For 2 days Isabella had remained stubborn, and now they were running out of time. This is still a terrible idea, Ethan said. Isabella looked up from the documents on the table. You've mentioned that 37 times. I counted. Ethan rubbed his forehead. I was hoping repetition would help. It hasn't. Nuke? It hasn't. Silence filled the room. Finally Ethan leaned back. What happens after? What do you mean? The revenge. He looked directly at her. Let's assume this works. Let's assume Victor is shocked. Let's assume society loses its mind. Then what? The question lingered. Truthfully, Isabella hadn't thought that far ahead. For days her focus had remained fixed on one thing. Victor. His arrogance. His betrayal. His certainty that she would always play the role he assigned her. The future beyond revenge remained blurry. I'll figure it out. Ethan sighed. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have. Outside the library windows, reporters had already begun gathering near the estate entrance. The media sensed something unusual. The wedding of the year had suddenly become a mystery. And mysteries attracted attention. A knock interrupted them. Richard Hart entered first. Eleanor followed immediately behind him. Neither looked happy. In fact, they looked furious. Richard closed the door behind them. What exactly is going on? The question wasn't directed at Ethan. It was directed at Isabella. She remained calm. I'm changing my wedding plans. Richard laughed once. A cold, humorless laugh. Changing? You canceled the cathedral. You canceled the guest seating. You removed Victor's family from the ceremony. That's not changing plans. That's detonating them. Eleanor crossed her arms. Tell us the truth. For a moment Isabella considered lying. Then she decided she was tired of protecting Victor. He's cheating. The room fell silent. Richard frowned. What? Victor is cheating on me. Neither parent spoke. The revelation stunned them. After several moments, Eleanor sat down slowly. Are you certain? Isabella slid her phone across the table. The photographs. The videos. The messages. Richard reviewed everything. His face darkened with every image. When he finished, his hands trembled slightly, not from sadness. From rage. No one embarrasses my family like this. For the first time in days, Isabella agreed completely. Eleanor looked devastated. I never liked him. Richard glanced toward her. You approved the engagement. I tolerated him. Different thing. Despite everything, Isabella almost smiled. Richard stood. The wedding is cancelled. No. All three turned toward Isabella. No. Richard stared at her. What do you mean no? I'm still getting married. Confusion spread across both parents' faces. Then realization arrived, slowly, horribly. Richard turned toward Ethan, then back to Isabella, then Ethan again. No? His voice was flat. Absolutely flat. No. Absolutely not. Eleanor looked equally shocked. Isabella? It's already decided. No. Richard slammed his hand against the table. This is insanity. I'm aware. You cannot marry your driver. Why not? The question caught everyone off guard. Even Ethan. Richard stared at his daughter. Because he stopped, searching for an answer. An answer that wouldn't sound terrible, but every explanation sounded terrible. Eventually he found one. Because you're angry. Correct. And angry people make mistakes. Also correct. Then stop. Isabella shook her head. No, for the next hour the argument continued. Nothing changed. Richard refused. Eleanor begged. Ethan remained silent. And Isabella stood firm. Eventually Richard realized the truth. His daughter had inherited the same stubbornness that built the Hart fortune. Once she made a decision, changing it became nearly impossible. Finally he pointed toward Ethan. Do you actually want this? Every eye in the room turned toward him. Ethan answered honestly. No. The room froze. Even Isabella looked surprised. No. Ethan shook his head. No. I don't want revenge. I don't want publicity. I don't want headlines. I don't want any of this. Richard almost looked relieved. Then Ethan continued. But I won't let her face this alone. The relief vanished instantly. Ethan met Richard's gaze. Someone hurt her. Someone manipulated her. Someone assumed there would be no consequences. I'm not comfortable with this. But I'm even less comfortable walking away. Silence returned. For the first time, Richard saw something he hadn't expected. Conviction. Not ambition. Not greed. Conviction. The driver wasn't trying to climb social ladders. If anything, he seemed desperate to avoid them. And somehow that made the situation worse. Because it made him harder to dismiss. 3 days later, the wedding arrived. The city woke up expecting one event. Instead it received another. News spread shortly after sunrise. Victor Langford removed from wedding. Replacement groom confirmed. Identity unknown. The internet exploded. Television stations interrupted programming. Business reporters abandoned financial coverage. Social media descended into complete chaos. Nobody could believe it. At Hart Manor, preparations continued at a frantic pace. Makeup artists, photographers, security personnel, wedding coordinators. Everyone rushed through the mansion. Meanwhile, Ethan stood alone in a guest room, staring at himself in a mirror. The black suit fit perfectly. That somehow made everything worse, because it made the situation feel real, very real. A knock sounded. Come in. The door opened. Isabella entered. For a moment, neither spoke. The transformation was stunning. Her wedding dress seemed almost unreal. Elegant, timeless, powerful. Yet beneath the beauty, Ethan noticed something else. Nervousness. The first genuine nervousness he'd seen from her. You can still change your mind, he said. She smiled softly. So can you. Neither moved. Neither retreated. Eventually, Isabella extended her hand. Ethan looked at it. Then took it. A simple gesture, yet somehow it felt important. Outside, reporters crowded every entrance. Helicopters circled overhead. News vans lined nearby streets. The entire city waited. And across town, Victor Langford finally learned the truth. Witnesses later claimed the scream could be heard throughout the building. His fury was immediate, absolute, uncontrollable. He drove toward the wedding venue personally, ignoring calls, ignoring warnings, ignoring everything, because this wasn't supposed to happen. Isabella wasn't supposed to fight back. She wasn't supposed to replace him. And she definitely wasn't supposed to replace him with her driver. The humiliation was unbearable. At the cathedral, guests filled every seat. Confusion dominated every conversation. Then the music began. The massive doors opened. Isabella appeared. Conversations stopped instantly. Hundreds of people watched her walk down the aisle. But they weren't looking at her. Not really. They weren't looking at the man waiting at the altar. Ethan Cole, the driver, the chauffeur, the invisible man nobody had ever noticed. The shock was immediate. Faces froze. Whispers erupted. Several guests literally stood up. Others reached for their phones. The disbelief was overwhelming. Richard and Eleanor watched silently. Neither approved. Yet neither intervened. Because despite everything, they had reached one conclusion. If Isabella intended to burn down the entire social order, nobody could stop her. The ceremony began. The minister spoke. The guests listened, and somewhere outside the cathedral, Victor Langford arrived. Furious, humiliated, desperate, he pushed through security, ignored warnings, and stormed toward the entrance. The doors burst open. Every head turned. Victor stood there breathing heavily, his face red with rage. The ceremony stopped. Silence consumed the cathedral. For several seconds nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then Victor pointed directly at Ethan. You. The accusation echoed through the room. Ethan remained calm. Victor turned toward Isabella. You can't be serious. The entire cathedral waited. Thousands watching online waited. The city waited. And Isabella smiled. Not kindly. Not warmly. Dangerously. Then she spoke words Victor would remember for the rest of his life. Oh, I'm completely serious. The cathedral exploded into chaos. The cathedral erupted into noise. Guests stood from their seats. Reporters rushed toward the entrance. Security personnel moved immediately. And Victor Langford looked as though he might explode. For several seconds, nobody knew what would happen next. The minister stood frozen. The wedding guests whispered frantically. Phones appeared everywhere. Everyone wanted footage. Everyone wanted proof. This was already becoming the biggest scandal the city had seen in years. Victor took several steps forward, his eyes locked onto Isabella. You've lost your mind. The words echoed through the cathedral. Isabella remained calm, almost frighteningly calm. No. Victor laughed bitterly. No. You canceled our wedding. You replaced me. And you married your driver. The last word dripped with contempt. As if Ethan wasn't even a person. As if his entire value could be measured by his profession. Something about that bothered Isabella more than she expected. For years she had probably viewed Ethan the same way. Not intentionally. Not maliciously. But she had never truly looked beyond the uniform. Now she was beginning to understand how wrong that had been. Victor pointed toward Ethan. This is ridiculous. He works for you. Worked for me. Isabella corrected him. The emphasis wasn't lost on anyone. Victor's face darkened. You married him to hurt me. The accusation hung in the air. The truth was obvious. Everyone knew it. Even Ethan. But Isabella refused to give Victor the satisfaction. I married him because I chose him. Victor stared at her. For the first time since they met, he couldn't predict her. That uncertainty terrified him. Security finally approached. The cathedral administration had reached its limit. Victor was escorted toward the exit. He fought it briefly. Then stopped. Because he realized something. The damage had already been done. Every camera had captured the moment. Every guest had witnessed his humiliation. The city would know within hours. As he reached the doors, Victor turned one final time. His eyes moved from Isabella to Ethan. Then back again. This isn't over. The threat lingered. Then he disappeared. The doors closed. Silence followed. The ceremony resumed shortly afterward, but nobody paid attention. Not really. The guests were already imagining headlines, already composing messages, already spreading the story. The wedding itself became secondary. The scandal was what mattered. 2 hours later, Ethan and Isabella left the cathedral as husband and wife. The crowd outside was overwhelming. Hundreds of reporters, dozens of cameras, questions flying from every direction. Why did you replace Victor? When did your relationship begin? Was Ethan secretly involved all along? Are the cheating allegations true? How long have you known each other? Security struggled to maintain order. The newlyweds barely reached their vehicle. Inside the car, silence filled the cabin. For the first time all day, they were alone. No reporters, no family, no guests, no cameras. Just the two of them. And reality. Ethan loosened his tie. I think we may have created a problem. Isabella laughed. A genuine laugh. Only one? That surprised him. She looked lighter somehow. Not happy, not completely, but freer. As if a weight had finally been removed. Any regrets? He asked. She looked out the window, thinking carefully. Then she answered honestly. No. Ethan nodded. Good. What about you? He considered the question, longer than she expected. Ask me tomorrow. That made her smile. The drive to Hart Manor felt strangely different. The mansion she'd lived in for years suddenly seemed unfamiliar. Because everything had changed. Nothing about the building was different. Nothing about the grounds. Nothing about the staff. Yet somehow everything felt new. When the car stopped outside the entrance, reality returned quickly. Staff members lined the walkway. Waiting. Watching. Uncertain. Nobody knew how to behave. After all, their employer had just married another employee, a situation rarely covered in training manuals. Ethan noticed their discomfort immediately. So did Isabella. She stepped forward first. Nothing changes. The staff exchanged confused glances. Isabella continued. You'll treat Ethan with the same respect you give any member of this family. Several employees visibly relaxed. Others looked shocked. But nobody argued. The message was clear. Very clear. Inside the mansion, things became even more awkward. The master suite had been prepared. 1 bedroom, 1 bed, 1 marriage, 1 enormous problem. Ethan stood in the doorway staring at the room. Then he turned around. No. Isabella blinked. What? New. He pointed toward the massive bed. I'm not sleeping there. She almost laughed. It's a bed. It's your bed. It's our bed. No. The answer came immediately. Firmly. Decisively. Isabella folded her arms. We're married. Technically. Legally. Unfortunately. That finally made her laugh. For several seconds neither could stop smiling. Then reality returned. Eventually they reached a compromise. Ethan moved into one of the mansion's guest suites, far enough away to avoid awkwardness, close enough to maintain appearances if necessary. Problem solved. At least temporarily. The following morning, the consequences began arriving. First came social media. Millions of views. Millions of comments. Millions of opinions. Some supported Isabella. Others mocked her. Many assumed she had completely lost her mind. Then came the newspapers. Billionaire marries driver after wedding scandal. Society wedding turns into public revenge. The driver who stole a billionaire bride. The headlines grew more ridiculous by the hour. By lunchtime, television crews had permanently stationed themselves outside the estate. By evening, international media outlets were covering the story. The entire world seemed fascinated. Unfortunately, fascination wasn't always positive. That became obvious during Isabella's first public appearance after the wedding. A business luncheon. One she couldn't avoid. When she entered the venue with Ethan, every conversation stopped. Every single one. People stared openly. Whispers spread instantly. The judgment was impossible to miss. Some guests tried hiding it. Others didn't bother. One woman actually laughed. Another shook her head. A group of executives exchanged amused glances. The message was obvious. They thought Isabella had made a mistake. A huge mistake. For several minutes, she tolerated it. Then she heard something that changed everything. A man standing nearby spoke quietly to his friend. Unfortunately for him, Isabella heard every word. "She's having a breakdown." His friend nodded. "No sane woman marries a driver." The words weren't directed at Ethan. Not really. But they landed anyway. Isabella glanced toward her husband. His expression remained neutral. Calm. Controlled. As if he hadn't heard anything. Yet she knew he had. Anyone would have. And suddenly she felt something unexpected. Anger. Not at Victor. Not this time. At them. At people who measured human worth through titles and salaries. At people who assumed character could be purchased. Without hesitation, Isabella approached the two men. The room fell silent again. "Excuse me." The businessman froze. One attempted a nervous smile. "Miss Hart." "Mrs. Cole." The correction stunned them. The room became even quieter. "If you're going to discuss my marriage," Isabella continued, "at least be brave enough to do it loudly." Neither man spoke. Neither man moved. Because there was nothing they could say. The humiliation was complete. Across the room, Ethan watched everything. And for the first time since this entire situation began, something shifted inside him. Because Isabella wasn't defending herself, she was defending him. The realization felt strange, unexpected, dangerous. After the luncheon ended, they returned to the car. Neither spoke for several minutes. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did." "Knew." He looked at her. "You really didn't." Isabella met his gaze. "Maybe." Then she smiled slightly. "But I wanted to." Neither spoke again. Yet the atmosphere felt different, less awkward, less forced. The revenge marriage remained fake. The emotions remained complicated. The future remained uncertain. But for the first time, a small foundation was beginning to form. Not romance. Not yet. Something else. Respect. Unfortunately, while respect was growing inside the marriage, trouble was growing outside it. Across the city, Victor Langford sat alone in his penthouse. Television screens surrounded him. Every channel carried the same story, the same images, the same humiliation. Isabella, Ethan. The wedding, the betrayal. His reputation was collapsing. His business partners were asking questions. His investors were nervous. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. And every second made him angrier. On the largest screen, a reporter displayed a photograph of Ethan and Isabella leaving the cathedral together. Victor stared at it. His jaw tightened. His hands clenched. Then slowly, very slowly, he smiled. Not a happy smile, a dangerous one. Because humiliation wasn't something Victor tolerated. And if Isabella wanted war, he was prepared to give her one. The first move had belonged to her. The next move would belong to him. 1 week after the wedding, the excitement should have started fading. It didn't. If anything, it became worse. Everywhere Isabella and Ethan went, people stared. Restaurants, corporate events, charity functions, business meetings. Even simple errands became public spectacles. The city remained obsessed with one question. Why would a billionaire heiress marry her driver? Most people refused to believe the answer was simple. Because the truth was less entertaining than the rumors. Secret affair, hidden pregnancy, elaborate business scheme, family scandal. Conspiracy theories multiplied daily. Meanwhile, the reality was much less dramatic. Two people trapped inside a decision neither fully understood. And every day the pressure grew heavier. The first major test arrived at the annual Hart Foundation Gala. For over 20 years, the event had been one of the most exclusive gatherings in the country. Business leaders, celebrities, politicians, media executives. Everyone attended. And this year everyone wanted a front Row seat to the scandal. The moment Isabella stepped from the limousine, camera flashes exploded. Ethan exited beside her. The reaction was immediate. Some reporters focused on Isabella. Most focused on Ethan, the driver who became a husband. The impossible story, the unusual headline. As they entered the grand ballroom, conversation stopped. Exactly as they always did now. Thousands of eyes followed them, judging, questioning, analyzing, looking for flaws, looking for weakness, looking for proof that the marriage would fail. Richard Hart stood near the stage speaking with investors. When he noticed Ethan and Isabella enter together, a complicated expression crossed his face. His anger had cooled over the past week. His confusion had not. Eleanor stood beside him. Unlike her husband, she had spent the week observing Ethan carefully, watching how he treated staff, watching how he behaved around Isabella, watching how he handled attention. She still didn't approve of the marriage, but she was beginning to respect the man. A realization she found deeply annoying. Across the ballroom, another pair of eyes watched Ethan closely. Victor Langford. The sight immediately soared Isabella's mood. Victor looked perfect as always. Expensive suit, confident smile, relaxed posture. Anyone unfamiliar with the situation would never suspect his life was unraveling behind the scenes. Their eyes met briefly. Victor raised a glass, a silent challenge, a silent warning. Isabella ignored him. The evening continued. For a while. Then the attacks began. Not openly. Not directly. People like Victor's friends preferred subtle cruelty, the kind that could be denied later, the kind delivered with smiles. The first came during dinner. A wealthy banker leaned toward Ethan. "So what was your secret?" Ethan looked up. The man smiled. "Most drivers spend years trying to get promoted. You skipped several levels." Several guests laughed. The table erupted with amusement. Everyone except Ethan and Isabella. The insult hung in the air, deliberate, calculated, cruel. Ethan calmly sipped his water. "I suppose I got lucky." The banker laughed. "Oh, definitely." More laughter. The conversation moved on. But the message remained. Hours later, another guest approached. This time a socialite. A woman Isabella had known for years. She smiled sweetly. The fake kind of smile wealthy people perfected early in life. "How are you adjusting?" Ethan remained polite. "Very well, I'm sure." The woman glanced around the ballroom. "It must be quite a change." "What is?" "Living this lifestyle." The implication was obvious. She didn't see Ethan as a husband. She saw him as an outsider, a visitor, someone who didn't belong. Ethan smiled politely. "I've spent years driving people here. I was already familiar with it." The socialite blinked. Her intended insult had failed. She quickly excused herself. Isabella watched the exchange carefully. "How do you stay so calm?" Ethan shrugged. "I've heard worse." The answer bothered her. Not because she doubted it, because she believed it. How many years had people treated him this way? How many conversations like that had he endured? How many times had society dismissed him before learning his name? The thought lingered, and it grew more uncomfortable with every passing hour. Later that evening, Isabella stepped onto a balcony overlooking the city. The fresh air helped, at least temporarily. The ballroom had become exhausting. Pretending not to notice constant judgment required energy. Energy she was rapidly losing. Several moments later, Ethan joined her. Neither spoke immediately. The city lights stretched endlessly below, beautiful, peaceful, unlike the ballroom behind them. "Rough night?" Ethan asked. She laughed softly. "You noticed?" "A little." For several seconds they simply stood together, enjoying the silence. Then Isabella asked something she had never considered before. "Did they always treat you like this?" Ethan understood immediately. "Sometimes. Sometimes. Most people aren't that obvious." The answer wasn't comforting. "Doesn't it bother you?" "It used to." He looked toward the skyline. "Eventually you stop caring." Isabella wasn't convinced. Nobody stopped caring completely. People simply learned how to hide the damage. Before she could respond, another voice interrupted. Victor. Of course it was Victor. The man appeared from the ballroom carrying a glass of champagne. His smile looked friendly, which immediately made Isabella suspicious. Mind if I join you? Yes. The answer came instantly. Victor laughed. I missed your honesty. Ethan remained silent. Victor studied him carefully, almost like a scientist observing an unusual experiment. Interesting situation. Nobody responded. Victor continued anyway. I keep wondering how long this lasts. There it was, the real reason he'd come outside. Not conversation. Provocation. Longer than your engagement lasted, Isabella replied. Victor's smile faltered briefly. Only briefly. Then it returned. You still seem angry. I'm divorced from your future. Not angry. That one landed. Victor's jaw tightened. For a second his mask slipped. The charming businessman disappeared, revealing something darker underneath. Then the mask returned. I'm worried about you. Isabella laughed. Actually laughed. The audacity was unbelievable. You're worried about me, of course. Victor gestured toward Ethan. This isn't your world. The insult wasn't directed at Isabella. It was directed at Ethan, and everyone knew it. Ethan finally spoke. You're right. Victor seemed surprised. What? This isn't my world. The answer caught everyone off guard, including Isabella. Ethan continued. I didn't grow up in it. I wasn't born into it. I didn't inherit it. Victor smiled, believing he'd won. Then Ethan finished. But after spending years around it, I'm not convinced that's a disadvantage. Silence. Absolute silence. Victor stared at him. The response had been calm, polite, respectful, and devastating. For the first time, Victor realized something uncomfortable. Ethan wasn't intimidated by him. Not anymore. The realization unsettled him, because intimidation was one of Victor's favorite tools. Without it, he felt vulnerable. The conversation ended shortly afterward. Victor returned inside. But the damage lingered. Later that night, as the gala approached its conclusion, an announcement was made. The Hart Foundation would recognize several individuals for outstanding service and dedication. Normally nobody paid much attention. This year became different. One of the recipients was Ethan. The reason was simple. For years he had quietly organized transportation programs for elderly residents through charitable partnerships connected to the Hart Foundation. Most people hadn't known. Most people had never asked. The recognition surprised the audience. Several guests appeared genuinely shocked. The same man they'd mocked all evening was now standing on stage receiving an award for community service. The irony was impossible to ignore. As Ethan accepted the recognition, applause filled the ballroom. Not polite applause, real applause, earned applause. And for the first time all night, the room saw something other than a driver. They saw a person, a capable person, a respected person, a person with value beyond a job title. Isabella watched from her table. Something warm settled in her chest. Pride, unexpected pride. The feeling surprised her, because she wasn't supposed to care. This marriage was temporary, strategic, transactional. At least that's what she kept telling herself. Yet watching Ethan stand on that stage felt important. More important than it should have. Across the ballroom, Victor noticed it too. The way Isabella looked at Ethan. The way Ethan looked back. Nothing romantic. Not yet. But something was changing. Something dangerous. Something Victor hadn't anticipated. And, for the first time since the wedding, genuine concern appeared in his eyes. Because revenge marriages were supposed to fail. They weren't supposed to evolve. They weren't supposed to create bonds. And if Isabella and Ethan actually became a real couple, Victor risked losing something he still believed belonged to him. As the gala ended and guests departed, one truth became increasingly clear. Society still judged Ethan. Society still mocked him. Society still doubted him. But cracks were beginning to appear. The image people had created of him was starting to crumble. And once that process began, it became very difficult to stop. Unfortunately for Ethan and Isabella, Victor wasn't interested in stopping it. He was interested in destroying it. And somewhere in the darkness of the city, he was already preparing his next move. The attack came 3 days later, not from Victor, not directly, but from a newspaper. A small business publication released an article questioning Ethan's sudden rise into high society. The headline was carefully crafted. Driver marries billionaire. Fairy tale or opportunism. The article never accused Ethan of anything illegal. It didn't need to. Instead, it planted questions. Questions designed to create doubt. Had Ethan manipulated Isabella? Had he planned this for years? Had he used his position to gain access to wealth? The accusations were subtle, professional, dangerous, because lies often sounded more believable when disguised as questions. By noon, several larger outlets had picked up the story. By evening, social media was flooded with opinions. Everyone suddenly became an expert. Everyone suddenly knew Ethan's motives. People who had never met him were analyzing his character. People who knew nothing about him were deciding who he was. Inside Hart Manor, Isabella threw the newspaper across her office. This is ridiculous. Ethan sat calmly across from her. It was inevitable. No. She shook her head. It wasn't. People don't get to invent stories about you. A small smile appeared on Ethan's face. Apparently they do. The response irritated her. Not because he was wrong. Because he seemed completely unaffected. Why aren't you angry? Ethan looked toward the window. The gardens stretched across the estate grounds. Beautiful. Peaceful. Far away from the chaos surrounding them. I spent most of my life being underestimated. He shrugged. It loses its impact eventually. And again that answer. Again that calm acceptance. And again it bothered Isabella, because nobody became that calm without experience. Painful experience. Tell me something. Ethan looked back at her. What? Who are you? The question surprised him. What does that mean? It means I don't know anything about you. She leaned back in her chair. We've spent 4 years around each other. I know your name. I know you drive well. I know you drink coffee. And that's about it. For several moments, Ethan remained silent. Then he laughed softly. That sounds accurate. I'm serious. So am I. The realization felt strange. They were married, yet practically strangers. The situation would have been funny if it weren't so absurd. Eventually Isabella stood. Come with me. We're. Lunch. I'm working. No. She grabbed her coat. You're eating lunch. 20 minutes later they were sitting in a small cafe across town. Not a luxury restaurant, not a private club, just a simple neighborhood cafe. The kind of place Isabella had never entered before. People recognized her immediately. But unlike the elite social circles, nobody seemed interested in judging Ethan. The atmosphere felt refreshingly normal. A waitress approached. Her eyes widened when she recognized Isabella. Then she noticed Ethan. Instead of surprise, she smiled. Good to see you again. Isabella blinked. You know him? The waitress laughed. Of course. Ethan comes here all the time. Ethan suddenly looked uncomfortable, which immediately caught Isabella's attention. Interesting. Very interesting. The waitress continued. He practically lives here. Best customer we have. After she left, Isabella folded her arms. You've been hiding things. It's a cafe. Apparently it's your cafe. Ethan sighed. This was a mistake. No. A smile appeared. This is becoming interesting. As lunch continued, something unusual happened. People kept approaching Ethan. An elderly man stopped by the table. Then a young couple. Then a store owner from nearby. Every conversation was friendly, warm, genuine, and every person seemed genuinely happy to see him. Eventually, Isabella couldn't ignore it anymore. What's happening? Ethan looked trapped, which only made her more curious. The elderly man answered before Ethan could. He's too modest. The man smiled. Ethan helped me after my surgery. Another person joined. He paid for my daughter's textbooks. A third person nodded. He helped us move when our apartment flooded. More stories followed, one after another. Small acts, quiet acts, kind acts, none of them public, none of them advertised, none of them connected to cameras or publicity. By the time they left the cafe, Isabella was speechless. The image she'd built of Ethan continued falling apart, and something far more impressive was emerging underneath. Back at the mansion, she found herself thinking about those stories. Hours later, she knocked on Ethan's office door. "Come in." He looked up from paperwork. She sat down across from him. No more avoiding the question. "What question?" "Who are you?" Ethan sighed heavily. The conversation he'd hoped to avoid had finally arrived. For a long moment he stared at the desk. Then he spoke. "My father died when I was 18. The words immediately changed the atmosphere. Gone was the joking. Gone was the curiosity. Only seriousness remained. Ethan continued. He worked construction. He was a good man. When he died, everything changed. His voice remained calm. But Isabella noticed something else. Pain, old pain. The kind that never completely disappears. My mother got sick 6 months later. He paused, looking at nothing, remembering. Medical bills piled up. Debt grew. The house was nearly lost. Isabella listened quietly. For the first time, she wasn't seeing Ethan the driver. She was seeing Ethan the man. "I was studying economics." The statement surprised her. "Economic studies." He nodded. "Full scholarship." "What happened?" A small smile appeared. A sad smile. "Life happened." The answer said everything. Sometimes dreams lost against reality. Sometimes responsibility won. "I left school. Started working. One job became 2. Then 3. He leaned back. "Eventually I became a driver." The simplicity of the story somehow made it more heartbreaking, because there had been no dramatic failure, no bad decisions, no scandal, just sacrifice, years of sacrifice. "For your mother." Ethan nodded. "For my mother." Silence followed. A heavy silence. Isabella thought about her own life, the advantages she'd inherited, the opportunities she'd never questioned, the safety she'd always assumed existed. And suddenly the gap between their worlds felt enormous. Not because Ethan had less, because he had carried more, much more. "Do you regret it?" The question lingered. Ethan thought carefully, longer than expected. Then he answered, "No." The response surprised her. "No. My mother survived." A small smile appeared. That's enough. For several seconds Isabella couldn't speak, because she realized something important. Victor would never have made that sacrifice. Victor wouldn't understand it. Most people in their social circle wouldn't understand it. Yet Ethan spoke about it as though it were obvious, as though there had never been another option. The realization stayed with her throughout the evening and into the next morning. Unfortunately, not everyone appreciated Ethan's story. Across the city, Victor received a copy of the newspaper article he'd secretly helped fund. The campaign was working. Public doubt was growing. Questions were spreading. Yet something frustrated him. The results weren't happening fast enough, because Ethan kept ruining the narrative. Every time someone dug into his past, they found something positive. Charity work, community service, recommendations, respect. The man was annoyingly difficult to discredit. Victor slammed the report onto his desk. There has to be something. His assistant remained silent, because there wasn't, at least not yet. Meanwhile, back at Hart Manor, Isabella stood on a balcony watching the sunset. The sky burned orange and gold across the horizon. Beautiful, peaceful, the opposite of her thoughts. Footsteps approached. Ethan. He joined her quietly. For several moments neither spoke. The silence felt comfortable now, much more comfortable than it once had. Finally, Isabella looked toward him. "You know what your problem is?" Ethan sighed. "This should be interesting." You're too good? He laughed. That's not usually considered a problem. It is when people assume the worst. The smile faded. A strange expression replaced it. Something softer. Something more genuine. Thank you. The simple words surprised her. Because Ethan rarely accepted praise, rarely accepted recognition. Yet this time he seemed sincere. For a brief moment their eyes met, and something shifted. Not dramatically. Not obviously. Just enough to be noticed. Just enough to matter. Neither mentioned it. Neither understood it completely. But it was there. The first spark of something neither had expected, and neither was prepared for. Far below the balcony, the mansion lights began illuminating the grounds as darkness settled over the estate. Neither noticed the black car parked across the distant road. Neither noticed the camera lens pointed toward them. Neither noticed the man inside taking photographs. But Victor noticed. Because Victor had arranged it, and as he studied the images arriving on his phone, a slow smile spread across his face. The rumors hadn't worked. The mockery hadn't worked. The social pressure hadn't worked. So now it was time for something bigger. Something more dangerous. Something capable of destroying Ethan completely. And this time, Victor intended to make sure it succeeded. Victor Langford had always believed that every person had a weakness. The challenge was finding it. Once you discovered the weakness, everything else became easy. Businesses, competitors, relationships, people. Everyone broke eventually. You simply had to apply enough pressure. For weeks he had watched Ethan Cole carefully. The driver refused to react. Refused to lose control. Refused to make mistakes. That frustrated Victor more than he cared to admit. Most people would have cracked by now. Most people would have become defensive, angry, embarrassed. Not Ethan. The man remained calm, steady, predictable. And Victor hated him for it. Especially because Isabella's attitude was changing. That bothered him most of all. At first, her marriage had seemed temporary, impulsive. A mistake made during emotional chaos. Now Victor wasn't so sure. Every public appearance showed the same pattern. Isabella defended Ethan. Ethan protected Isabella. The partnership was becoming stronger, and that represented a serious problem. Which meant it was finally time for a direct attack. The opportunity arrived on a Monday morning. A major business magazine published an exclusive article. The headline spread across every news outlet within hours. Secret connection between Ethan Cole and Hart Industries. The article included photographs. Old photographs. Carefully selected photographs. Photographs showing Ethan entering company buildings years before his employment records officially began. Photographs showing him meeting certain executives. Photographs showing him attending charity events connected to the Hart family. Taken individually, the images meant nothing. Together, they created suspicion. The article suggested a theory, a dangerous theory. What if Ethan's relationship with Isabella wasn't accidental? What if he'd been positioning himself for years? What if becoming a driver had been part of a larger plan? The accusations lacked evidence. But evidence wasn't necessary. The suggestion alone was enough. Public imagination did the rest. By lunchtime, the story dominated social media. By evening, television panels debated Ethan's motives. The speculation became ridiculous. Some claimed he was a master manipulator. Others called him a secret genius. One commentator actually described him as a social climber executing a decade-long strategy. Ethan nearly laughed when he heard that one. Unfortunately, Isabella wasn't laughing. She stormed into the mansion study carrying a tablet. "Have you seen this?" Ethan looked up. Unfortunately, she dropped the tablet onto the desk. "This is insane." Agreed. They literally invented an entire conspiracy. Ethan nodded. "Apparently I'm much smarter than I realized." Despite herself, Isabella smiled. Only briefly. Then the frustration returned. "This isn't funny." "No." His expression became serious. "It isn't." For several moments neither spoke. The article represented something new, something more dangerous than insults. This wasn't mockery. It was character assassination, and character assassination had consequences. Especially in the business world. The door suddenly opened. Richard Hart entered. His expression revealed immediately that something was wrong. Very wrong. Conference room. The words were short, sharp, urgent. Now. 20 minutes later, Isabella and Ethan sat across from Richard inside the mansion's private conference room. Several senior executives had joined them through video calls. The atmosphere felt tense, uncomfortable. One executive cleared his throat. "We've received concerns." Isabella immediately frowned. "Concerns?" Another executive nodded. "Investors are asking questions." About Ethan. The silence that followed felt heavy. Richard looked furious. Not at Ethan. At the situation. At the people creating it. At the fact that nonsense rumors were now affecting real business. "What kind of questions?" Isabella asked. The answer irritated her instantly. Whether Ethan's involvement creates reputational risks. Ethan leaned back quietly. There it was. The real objective. Victor wasn't attacking him personally. He was attacking Isabella's company through him. The strategy suddenly made perfect sense. Destroy trust. Create uncertainty. Generate fear. Then let investors do the rest. Richard finally spoke. This isn't about facts. It's about perception. Unfortunately, he was right. Perception often mattered more than reality, especially when money was involved. After the meeting ended, Isabella walked directly toward the mansion gardens. She needed air. Needed distance. Needed something other than boardrooms and rumors. Several minutes later, Ethan found her sitting beside a fountain. "You okay?" "No." The honesty surprised neither of them. "I'm tired." She stared into the water. Tired of defending reality. Tired of correcting lies. Tired of people deciding who you are without knowing anything. Ethan sat beside her. For a moment neither spoke. The fountain continued flowing quietly, a peaceful contrast to everything else. Finally Ethan shrugged. "They don't know me. That's the problem." He looked toward her. "No. They don't know me." The answer confused her. Then she understood. If strangers created opinions without facts, those opinions had no real value. At least theoretically. Unfortunately, humans rarely worked that way. Words still hurt. Rumors still spread. Damage still occurred, even when the accusations were false. Before she could respond, her phone rang. Victor. The sight of his name immediately soared her mood. She almost ignored it. Then, curiosity won. "What do you want?" Victor sounded cheerful. Far too cheerful. "Checking in?" "Don't." He laughed. "I saw the article. Congratulations." Isabella closed her eyes. "Was this you?" A brief pause. "Not long enough." "Just enough." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Lie." "Obvious lie." "Predictable lie." "Stay away from us." Victor's voice softened. Dangerously softened. "You still don't understand." "What?" "Ethan isn't the problem." The statement immediately caught her attention. "Then what is?" "You?" Silence. Victor continued. "You embarrassed powerful people. You exposed someone they respected. You disrupted expectations." His tone remained calm, controlled, calculated. "The world you're fighting doesn't forgive easily." The call ended, leaving Isabella staring at the phone. The conversation unsettled her, because beneath Victor's manipulation hid an uncomfortable truth. She had challenged an entire system, not just a person, and systems rarely enjoyed being challenged. That evening another unexpected problem emerged. Ethan received a call from someone he hadn't spoken to in years. Professor Daniel Reeves, his former university mentor. The conversation lasted nearly an hour. Afterward, Ethan sat quietly in the library, thinking, remembering, reflecting. Isabella eventually found him there. "You look serious." "I spoke with an old professor. Good news." "Maybe." He hesitated, then smiled faintly. He said something interesting. "What?" Ethan looked toward the bookshelves. "He said people only attack potential. The statement lingered. What does that mean? If nobody sees value in you, they ignore you. A small smile appeared. If they're attacking me this hard, he shrugged. Maybe they're more worried than they admit. The observation surprised her, because it contained confidence. Not arrogance. Not ego. Simple confidence. The kind earned through experience. For the first time, Isabella realized something important. Ethan wasn't merely surviving the attacks. He was growing stronger because of them. And that frightened Victor more than anything else. Across town, Victor sat inside his penthouse reviewing new reports. The article had worked. Partially. Investor anxiety had increased. Media attention had intensified. But Ethan remained standing. Still standing. Victor hated that. He hated it because the next phase would require greater risk, greater commitment, greater damage. He opened a folder on his desk. Inside were financial records, company reports, private documents, information gathered over months. A slow smile appeared. Because he had finally found something. Or at least something that looked convincing. And sometimes convincing was all that mattered. As rain began falling outside the penthouse windows, Victor closed the folder carefully. The first attack had weakened Ethan. The second attack would be far more dangerous. Because next time, Victor wouldn't target public opinion. He would target Ethan's future. And if everything went according to plan, Ethan Cole would lose far more than his reputation. The crisis arrived on a Thursday morning. At first, nobody realized how serious it was. A delayed shipment, a contract dispute, a disagreement between suppliers. The kind of business problem that appeared every day in large companies. Normally, Hart Industries handled such situations quickly. This time was different. By noon, 3 major projects had been affected. By 2 o'clock, investors were demanding explanations. By evening, the board had scheduled an emergency meeting. Something was wrong, very wrong. Inside the executive boardroom, tension filled the air. Senior executives argued across the massive conference table. Charts covered the screens. Financial projections flashed continuously. Everyone seemed to have an opinion. Unfortunately, nobody had a solution. The suppliers won't renegotiate. Why need additional financing? The timeline is impossible. Well missed the deadline. The arguments continued. Round and round. Hour after hour. Isabella sat at the head of the table listening carefully. Frustration grew with every passing minute. The executives were focused on symptoms, not causes, defending positions, not solving problems. Across the room, Ethan sat quietly. He wasn't supposed to be there, technically. As Isabella's husband, he occasionally attended meetings, usually as an observer, rarely as a participant. Most executives still viewed him as an outsider, which meant they largely ignored him. A mistake they were about to regret. Near the end of the meeting, one executive stood. "We need to postpone the project." Several others agreed. The proposal gained momentum quickly. Delay everything. Minimize losses. Accept defeat. Something about the recommendation bothered Ethan deeply. He reviewed the documents again. Then one more time. Finally, he frowned. Isabella noticed immediately. What? The room turned toward him. Several executives visibly rolled their eyes. Here comes the driver. The reaction wasn't subtle. Ethan ignored it. What if the suppliers aren't the real problem? Silence. One executive laughed softly. What does that mean? Ethan pointed toward a chart. The delays began before the contract dispute. Nobody responded. He continued. The timeline doesn't match. Another executive frowned. What are you saying? Ethan stood, slowly, calmly, then walked toward the screen. The room watched with varying levels of skepticism. Most expected him to embarrass himself. Instead, he began asking questions, simple questions, logical questions, questions nobody else had asked. Why did transportation costs increase before negotiations failed? Why were alternative suppliers rejected? Why did inventory orders suddenly change? One by one the executives checked their reports. One by one their expressions changed, because Ethan wasn't guessing. He was noticing patterns. Patterns they had missed. 30 minutes later, the entire direction of the meeting shifted. The supplier dispute wasn't causing the crisis. It was hiding the crisis. The real problem existed elsewhere, an internal logistics failure. One large enough to threaten millions in revenue, yet also fixable, if addressed quickly. For the first time all day, genuine progress emerged. The boardroom transformed. Arguments became discussions. Panic became strategy. Solutions began appearing. And throughout it all, Ethan remained calm, focused, analytical, as though he'd been doing this his entire life. Eventually, one executive spoke. "Where did you learn this?" The question hung in the room. Ethan paused, then answered honestly, "University." Several people looked confused. One board member leaned forward. "You studied logistics, economic systems." The room fell silent. Another executive blinked. "You studied economics." Ethan nodded. A strange atmosphere followed, because many people were experiencing the same realization simultaneously. They had spent weeks judging him, mocking him, dismissing him, without ever asking who he actually was. The meeting ended 3 hours later, and for the first time since the crisis began, Hart Industries had a plan. A real plan, not a temporary solution, not damage control, a genuine path forward. As executives filed from the room, several stopped to speak with Ethan. The same people who had ignored him earlier. The same people who barely acknowledged his existence. Funny how quickly respect appeared when competence became visible. After everyone left, Isabella remained seated, watching him, thinking, processing. Eventually Ethan noticed. "What? You could have told me." "Told you what?" "That you're apparently a genius." He laughed. "I'm definitely not a genius." "Then what was that?" "A board meeting." The answer made her shake her head. "No." She stood, walking toward him. "Everyone in that room has years of experience. And somehow you found the problem." Ethan shrugged. Fresh perspective. "That's not all." He looked away, which immediately confirmed her suspicion. "There was more. Much more. You miss it." "What?" "This." He remained silent. She continued. "Business, strategy, problem solving. You miss it." For several seconds Ethan said nothing. Then finally he nodded. Sometimes. The honesty surprised both of them, because Ethan rarely discussed himself, rarely admitted personal regrets. Yet this answer came easily, naturally, as though he'd carried it for years. "My professor used to say something." "What?" He said, "Economics isn't really about money." Isabella folded her arms. "What is it about?" "People." A faint smile appeared. "Money just helps track decisions." The answer felt surprisingly profound, and somehow very Ethan. Practical, simple, thoughtful. The conversation ended when Richard entered unexpectedly. The older man looked unusually serious. Everyone else leave. The remaining assistants immediately exited. Within moments only Richard, Isabella, and Ethan remained. Richard sat slowly, studying Ethan. A long silence followed. Then he spoke. "You saved us several $1 million today." Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "I helped, num." Richard shook his head. "You saved us several $1 million. The distinction mattered. A lot. Because Richard Hart was not a man who offered praise casually. In fact, many considered him incapable of praise. Yet here it was. Direct. Unambiguous. Earned. Ethan didn't know how to respond. Fortunately, Richard continued. "I looked into your academic records." That immediately caught Ethan's attention. "Sir, you graduated top of your class before leaving." Another silence. Richard leaned back. "Why didn't you ever mention that?" The answer arrived instantly. Nobody asked. For several moments Richard simply stared at him. Then something unexpected happened. The older man laughed. Actually laughed. A short, genuine laugh. "I suppose that's fair." When Richard finally left, Isabella remained frozen. Because she'd never seen her father laugh with Ethan before. Never. Not once. Something fundamental was changing. Not only for her. For everyone. The following week provided further evidence. Several executives began consulting Ethan voluntarily, requesting opinions, asking questions, seeking advice. Nothing official, nothing formal. Yet the shift was obvious. Respect was growing, slowly, steadily, naturally. Unfortunately, respect for Ethan created a new problem. Victor noticed. And Victor hated it. Inside his penthouse office, he reviewed reports from contacts inside Hart Industries. The crisis. The board meeting. Ethan's involvement. Every detail made him angrier. Because Ethan was supposed to fail. That was the plan. The driver wasn't supposed to impress executives. He wasn't supposed to solve problems. He wasn't supposed to earn respect. Victor slammed the report onto his desk. Impossible. But it wasn't impossible. It was happening. And that reality terrified him. Because every success made Ethan harder to attack, harder to discredit, harder to remove. Which meant Victor's next move needed to be decisive. Permanent. Destructive. He opened the folder he'd prepared earlier. Financial records. Forged evidence. Manufactured transactions. Everything carefully constructed. Everything designed to point toward one conclusion. Fraud. A slow smile spread across his face. The boardroom victory had given Ethan momentum. Public support. Professional credibility. Unfortunately for Ethan, momentum could disappear quickly. Especially when scandal entered the picture. Across town, completely unaware of the danger approaching, Isabella and Ethan stood together on the mansion balcony. The city lights stretched endlessly below. Beautiful, peaceful, hopeful. For the first time since the wedding, both felt something unexpected. Optimism. The future seemed slightly brighter. The marriage slightly less complicated. The partnership slightly stronger. Neither noticed how close they were standing. Neither mentioned it. Yet the distance between them continued shrinking. Little by little. Day by day. And somewhere in the darkness, Victor prepared to strike. Because he understood something they didn't. The stronger Ethan became, the harder he would fall. At least, that was the plan. The morning after the boardroom victory felt different. Not dramatically different. Not obviously different. Just enough to notice. For the first time since their marriage began, Ethan wasn't being treated like an outsider inside Hart Industries. Employees greeted him differently. Executives listened when he spoke. Managers sought his opinions. Small changes, but meaningful ones. And nowhere was the change more noticeable than in Isabella. Over the previous weeks, her perception of Ethan had transformed completely. The quiet driver she thought she knew no longer existed. In his place stood someone far more impressive. Someone she'd never bothered to truly see. That realization stayed with her during breakfast, and lunch, and most of the afternoon. By evening, she finally admitted something uncomfortable. She respected him. Genuinely. Deeply. Perhaps more than anyone else in her life. The thought should have felt simple. Instead, it felt complicated. Dangerously complicated. Especially because their marriage was still built on revenge. At least technically. That evening, Ethan was working in the mansion study when Isabella entered carrying 2 cups of coffee. He looked surprised. He made coffee. She placed 1 cup on the desk. Don't sound so shocked. I'm shocked. The answer made her laugh. A sound Ethan was hearing more often lately. Something he liked more than he expected. She sat across from him. What are you working on? Supply forecasts. Voluntarily. He nodded. You need a hobby. I have hobbies. She raised an eyebrow. Such as? Ethan paused. Then smiled. You wouldn't believe me. Try. The smile widened slightly. I restore motorcycles. Silence. Complete silence. Then Isabella blinked. What? Motorcycles. You restore motorcycles. He nodded. She stared at him. The image simply didn't fit. The calm, reserved driver spending weekends rebuilding engines. Impossible. And yet somehow perfectly believable. You're serious. Very. For the next 20 minutes, Ethan described his workshop. The old motorcycles, the restoration projects, the mechanical challenges, the satisfaction of rebuilding something broken. And as Isabella listened, she found herself fascinated. Not by motorcycles, by him. Because every new story revealed another layer, another surprise, another reason she realized how little she had truly known. Eventually she interrupted. How many hidden talents do you have? Ethan looked thoughtful. Hopefully no more. She laughed again. The conversation continued long after the coffee disappeared. Hours passed unnoticed, and neither seemed eager to leave. At some point, Isabella realized something strange. This was the longest casual conversation she'd ever had with Ethan. Maybe the longest enjoyable conversation she'd had with anyone in months. The realization unsettled her. Not because it was bad, because it felt good. Very good. The next day brought another surprise. Richard Hart requested Ethan's presence at a corporate strategy session. Officially, not as Isabella's husband, not as an observer, as a participant. The invitation shocked nearly everyone, especially Ethan. Your father has lost his mind. Isabella smiled. Possibly. He wants my opinion. Yes. Repeatedly. Also yes. Ethan shook his head. The situation remained surreal. A few weeks earlier he'd been driving executives to meetings. Now he was attending them. Life had become increasingly absurd. The strategy session lasted 6 hours. When it finally ended, several executives approached Ethan afterward. Not out of obligation, out of genuine interest. One invited him to dinner. Another requested help on a project. A third offered networking opportunities. The shift was impossible to ignore. Respect wasn't being forced anymore. It was being earned. Meanwhile, Isabella watched everything carefully, and every observation produced the same conclusion. People liked Ethan. Not because of his connection to her. Because of who he was. The distinction mattered. A lot. Later that week, another unexpected moment occurred. The Hart family hosted a private gathering at the mansion. Close friends. Business associates. Longtime family connections. The kind of event Ethan usually avoided. Unfortunately, attendance was unavoidable. As the evening progressed, Isabella found herself trapped in a conversation with several investors. The discussion dragged endlessly. Corporate acquisitions, market forecasts, profit margins, the usual topics. Eventually she glanced across the room and noticed something strange. A crowd had formed around Ethan. Not a large crowd, but noticeable. Curious, she moved closer. The scene surprised her. Ethan was telling a story. A story involving one of his early driving jobs. Apparently the experience had ended with a runaway goat, a wedding reception, and a police officer. The details sounded ridiculous. The audience loved it. People were laughing. Actually laughing. Not polite social laughter. Real laughter. Even Richard appeared amused. Isabella stood quietly watching, a smile slowly forming. Because she suddenly understood something. Ethan wasn't respected despite his background. He was respected because of his background. His experiences made him different, authentic, interesting. Most people in their social circles spent their lives around identical environments, identical schools, identical neighborhoods, identical opportunities. Ethan hadn't, and that made him unique. The realization felt oddly satisfying, perhaps because it validated what she'd already begun feeling. Perhaps because she enjoyed seeing people proven wrong. Or perhaps for another reason entirely. One she wasn't ready to examine. The evening continued smoothly, until Eleanor approached her privately. That immediately created concern, because Eleanor rarely initiated serious conversations. Walk with me. The request sounded innocent. It wasn't. Mothers possessed special abilities, and Eleanor Hart possessed more than most. Several minutes later, they stood alone in the mansion gardens. The evening air felt cool, comfortable, dangerous, because Isabella already suspected where this conversation was heading. Eleanor smiled softly. You look happier. There it was. The observation. The beginning. I'm fine. No. Eleanor shook her head. You're happier. Isabella looked away. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do. Unfortunately, she did. The problem was admitting it. Eleanor continued walking. He makes you laugh. The statement sounded simple, yet somehow it carried enormous weight. He respects you. Another statement. Another uncomfortable truth. He listens. A third, and perhaps the most important. Isabella stopped walking. You approved of Victor. Eleanor sighed. I approved of the idea of Victor. The distinction mattered. A lot. The older woman smiled sadly. I was wrong. Silence followed. Then Eleanor said something unexpected. Don't make the same mistake. What mistake? Confusing appearances with character. The words lingered long after the conversation ended. That night Isabella couldn't sleep. Not because of business problems. Not because of Victor. Not because of the media. Because of Ethan. Specifically, because she kept replaying moments. Small moments. Conversations. Smiles. Shared laughter. Growing trust. The memories felt dangerous because they suggested a possibility she wasn't prepared to confront. Near midnight, she wandered into the mansion kitchen, only to discover Ethan already there. The sight surprised both of them. Can't sleep. He smiled. You too. She nodded. For a moment, they simply stood there. Two people pretending not to understand what was happening. Two people avoiding obvious truths. Two people growing closer despite every reason not to. Eventually, Ethan prepared tea. They sat together at the kitchen island, talking quietly, comfortably, naturally. An hour passed. Then another. Neither noticed, because neither wanted the conversation to end. Across the city, Victor Langford reviewed a different kind of report. Photographs, surveillance notes, observations. Everything pointed toward the same conclusion. The relationship was changing. Fast. Faster than expected. The realization terrified him, because his window of opportunity was closing. Soon the marriage might become real. Soon emotions might become involved. Soon Isabella might become impossible to win back. Victor stared at the forged financial documents spread across his desk. The final phase was ready, prepared, waiting. A slow smile appeared, because within days, Ethan Cole would face accusations capable of destroying everything he had built. His reputation, his future, his marriage. And if Victor's plan worked, Isabella would finally discover what happened when people challenged him. The attack was coming. And this time, it would hit harder than anything before. The attack arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning. Not with warning. Not with preparation. And certainly not with mercy. Isabella was halfway through breakfast when her phone began vibrating nonstop. One message. Then another. Then 20 more. By the time she opened the first news article, the story had already spread everywhere. Financial scandal tied to Ethan Cole. Her stomach tightened. She opened the article immediately. The accusations were serious. Very serious. According to anonymous sources, Ethan had allegedly been involved in suspicious financial transfers connected to a former logistics company several years earlier. The article included documents, bank records, transaction histories, official-looking evidence. To anyone reading the story, the conclusion seemed obvious. Ethan had committed fraud. Isabella's first reaction wasn't panic. It was anger, because she knew Ethan, and nothing about the allegations made sense. Still, the evidence looked convincing, dangerously convincing. She immediately called him. No answer. A second call. Nothing. Then she remembered he was attending a meeting across town, probably unaware his life was being destroyed online. Within 30 minutes, she arrived at Hart Industries. Chaos greeted her immediately. Employees whispered throughout the building. Executives gathered in small groups. News channels played continuously on office televisions. Everyone had seen the story. Everyone was talking about it. Inside a conference room, Ethan sat across from Richard and several attorneys. His expression remained calm. Too calm. Almost unsettlingly calm. The moment Isabella entered, he looked up. "I'm guessing you've seen it." She dropped a folder onto the table. "This is ridiculous." One attorney cleared his throat. Unfortunately, ridiculous things can still cause damage. Nobody liked hearing that. Because it was true. The evidence appeared authentic. Very authentic. Enough to create legal concerns. Enough to create investor concerns. Enough to create public concern. Richard looked exhausted. The last several weeks had already strained the company. Now this. What actually happened? Isabella asked. Every eye turned toward Ethan. He studied the documents, then shook his head. "I've never seen any of this before." The answer came instantly. Without hesitation. Without uncertainty. The conviction in his voice mattered. Because liars usually hesitated. Liars usually calculated. Ethan simply answered, "No." One of the attorneys leaned forward. "Have you ever worked for this company?" Briefly. The room became silent. That wasn't the answer anyone expected. "You worked there." Ethan nodded. "Years ago. Before I joined the Hart family." Isabella frowned. "You never mentioned that." Ethan offered a faint smile. "You never asked." A fair point. Unfortunately, it didn't solve the problem. If anything, it made things more complicated. The attorneys continued questioning him. Dates, positions, projects, responsibilities. Every answer remained consistent, detailed, clear, and completely incompatible with the accusations. After 2 hours, one conclusion emerged. The documents were fake. The challenge would be proving it. That evening, the legal team began investigating aggressively. Meanwhile, Ethan returned to the mansion. For the first time in weeks, he looked tired. Not physically, emotionally. As though something deeper had been disturbed. Something old. Something painful. Isabella found him later that night in the library. The same library where everything had begun. The same library where she had proposed marriage. The room felt strangely symbolic now. "You okay?" The question sounded simple. The answer wasn't. Ethan stared at an old photograph in his hands. For several moments he didn't speak. Then he handed it to her. The image showed a younger version of him, standing beside 3 other students. Everyone smiling. Everyone hopeful. Everyone convinced the future belonged to them. "You were happy." A small smile appeared. "I was." She looked closer. The photograph had clearly been taken at a university campus. The pride on Ethan's face was obvious. So was the ambition. What happened? He leaned back slowly. For several moments, rain tapped softly against the library windows. The sound seemed to pull him backward through time. Back to a different life. A different future. A different version of himself. "I never told you why I left school." "No." I wasn't completely honest. That surprised her, because Ethan rarely hid things intentionally. "What do you mean?" The answer came quietly. "I left because my mother got sick." He paused. "That's true, but it wasn't the whole truth." The atmosphere shifted immediately. Isabella listened carefully. Ethan rarely opened up this much, which meant whatever came next mattered. "A lot. My father and I had plans." The faint smile returned. Sad. Nostalgic. Painful. He wanted me to finish school. He wanted me to build something. What kind of something? Anything. The answer made her smile slightly. That sounded like a father. Ethan continued. "We used to sit at the kitchen table for hours, talking about ideas, business models, investments, markets." His eyes drifted toward the photograph. "He believed I could do great things." Silence followed. Then he laughed softly. "Parents are usually biased." "No." Isabella shook her head. "Not always." The comment surprised him, but he appreciated it. After a moment he continued. "When he died, everything changed." The pain in his voice remained controlled, yet impossible to miss. "My mother needed help." The bills kept growing. The scholarship covered tuition, but it didn't cover life. That simple sentence explained everything. More effectively than any dramatic speech could, reality had arrived. And reality was expensive. I thought I'd return. He stared out the window. At first, 1 year became 2. 2 became 5. Then suddenly a decade had passed. The room fell silent, because both understood the tragedy. Not failure, not defeat, sacrifice. The kind most people never noticed. The kind that rarely appeared in headlines. The kind that quietly changed lives forever. Do you regret it? Again the question. Again the difficult answer. This time Ethan took longer. Much longer. Finally he nodded. Sometimes. The honesty surprised her. Because previously he'd always said no. Now the truth sounded different. More complete. I don't regret helping my mother. He clarified immediately. I regret abandoning myself. The words hit harder than expected, because everyone understood them. Everyone had dreams. Everyone made compromises. But few people admitted what those compromises cost. For several moments neither spoke. Then Isabella asked something unexpected. What was the dream? Or Ethan smiled. A real smile. One she hadn't seen before. I wanted to build companies. The answer arrived so naturally it almost sounded obvious. Not because I wanted money. Because I loved solving problems. He laughed softly. Probably explains the board meetings. She laughed too, probably. The conversation continued deep into the evening. For the first time, Ethan spoke openly about his university years. Professors, friends, projects, ideas, goals. And the more Isabella listened, the more stunned she became. Because the person sitting across from her wasn't merely intelligent. He was exceptional. The kind of person who could have built an extraordinary career under different circumstances. The realization felt strangely emotional. Not because of what he lost, because of how little bitterness he carried. Most people would have been angry, resentful, bitter. Ethan wasn't. He simply moved forward, adapted, survived, and somehow remained kind. That combination felt incredibly rare, dangerously rare. The next morning brought unexpected news. The legal team had completed its preliminary investigation. The alleged financial documents contained inconsistencies. Several signatures were forged. Transaction dates didn't match company records. Evidence of manipulation existed. Relief swept through Hart Manor. But only briefly. Because proving innocence took time. And public opinion rarely waited for facts. Across the city, Victor received the same report. His mood darkened immediately. The forged evidence wasn't collapsing yet. But cracks were appearing. And Victor hated cracks. Especially when his plans depended on certainty. He threw the report onto his desk. Then stared out the penthouse window. The city lights reflected across the glass. Cold. Distant. Unforgiving. Much like his thoughts. The fraud accusations should have created panic. Instead, they had produced something unexpected. Sympathy. Support. Even admiration. People kept discovering positive things about Ethan. The more they investigated him, the more they liked him. Victor clenched his fists. The situation was becoming intolerable. Because every attack seemed to strengthen the man. And worse than that it was strengthening Isabella's feelings. Victor could see it. Anyone could. The way she looked at Ethan. The way she defended him. The way they stood together. Something real was forming. Something Victor had never planned for. Back at Hart Manor, Isabella stood on the balcony outside the library. The rain had finally stopped. Cool air drifted through the night. Peaceful. Quiet. Comforting. Behind her, Ethan continued organizing old photographs. Fragments of a forgotten life. A forgotten dream. Yet as she watched him through the glass doors, a realization slowly settled into her heart. The world had spent weeks calling him a driver. A chauffier. An employee. A social climber. None of those labels described the man she now knew. The real Ethan Cole was something far more impressive. And for the first time since their marriage began, Isabella found herself wondering something dangerous. Very dangerous. What if she had married the right man after all? The thought lingered. refusing to disappear, growing stronger with every passing day. And neither of them realized how much that question was about to change their future. The question refused to leave Isabella alone. What if she had married the right man? For days it lingered in the back of her mind. During meetings, during dinners, during conversations. The thought appeared unexpectedly and disappeared just as quickly. Yet every time it returned, it felt slightly stronger, slightly more dangerous, because the answer was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Unfortunately, not everyone shared her growing admiration for Ethan. While public opinion had started shifting, certain members of the Hart family's extended circle remained deeply opposed to the marriage, and they were preparing to make their feelings known. The confrontation began on a Sunday afternoon. Richard had organized a family gathering at the estate. Officially, it was a birthday celebration for one of Isabella's uncles. Unofficially, it was something else entirely. An intervention. The moment Isabella entered the grand dining room, she sensed trouble. Too many relatives. Too many serious expressions. Too much forced politeness. The atmosphere felt wrong. Across the room, Ethan noticed it too. Years of reading people had sharpened his instincts, and his instincts were screaming. Something was coming. Sure enough, it didn't take long. Lunch had barely begun when Isabella's aunt, Margaret, cleared her throat. The room immediately became quieter. Margaret Hart was famous for two things: her wealth and her inability to mind her own business. How are the newlyweds doing? The question sounded harmless. It wasn't. Isabella recognized the tone immediately. The trap had arrived. We're doing fine. Margaret smiled. Wonderful. A pause. Then came the real attack. Though I must admit, I still struggle to understand the arrangement. Several relatives looked uncomfortable. Others looked interested. Richard closed his eyes briefly, already regretting the gathering. What arrangement? Isabella asked. Margaret looked directly at Ethan. The marriage. There it was. No subtlety, no disguise. Just direct criticism. The room became silent. Ethan calmly continued eating, as if the conversation had nothing to do with him. Unfortunately, it had everything to do with him. Margaret continued. We have always supported your happiness. Of course. But surely you understand people's concerns. Isabella set down her fork. What concerns? Margaret looked surprised, as though the answer should be obvious. Appearances. The word landed heavily. Richard immediately frowned. Eleanor looked annoyed. But Margaret wasn't finished. The family has responsibilities. A reputation. Certain expectations. Several relatives nodded quietly. The agreement irritated Isabella instantly. So this is about status. No. Margaret smiled. It's about reality. The conversation was rapidly becoming unpleasant. Very unpleasant. Then another relative joined. An uncle this time. We're simply worried. Worried. He nodded. You made a life-changing decision during an emotional period. The statement sounded reasonable, which made it more dangerous, because there was some truth hidden inside it. The wedding had been impulsive. The circumstances had been emotional. The difference was that nobody understood what had happened afterward. Nobody had witnessed the weeks that followed, the conversations, the support, the partnership, the growing trust. To them, Ethan remained a symbol, not a person, and that frustrated Isabella more than she expected. Before she could respond, Ethan spoke. It's okay. The room turned toward him. His voice remained calm, respectful, measured. I understand their concerns. Several relatives looked relieved, as if he were finally acknowledging reality. Then Ethan continued. If I were in their position, I might ask similar questions. The honesty surprised everyone, including Isabella. Margaret smiled. See, even Ethan understands. But Ethan wasn't finished. And if I only knew what happened at the wedding, I'd probably agree. The smile disappeared immediately. The room became quiet again. Very quiet. Ethan looked around the table. meeting everyone's eyes, one by one. But that's not the full story. No anger, no defensiveness, just simple truth. I understand why people question me. I don't understand why people refuse to know me. Silence. Absolute silence. Because nobody had an answer. The statement was impossible to argue with. Most of them had never spoken to Ethan beyond basic pleasantries. Most had already formed opinions. The realization made several relatives uncomfortable, as it should have. Margaret attempted one final attack. You can't blame people for noticing differences. Ethan smiled politely. No. I blame them for assuming those differences define value. The room froze. Again, Richard hid a smile. Eleanor looked suspiciously proud, and Isabella felt something she wasn't prepared for. Admiration. Powerful admiration. The lunch ended shortly afterward. Not because anyone wanted it to, because nobody knew what to say anymore. The intervention had failed. Spectacularly. After the guests departed, Richard remained behind in the dining room, staring at a glass of wine, thinking. Ethan entered a few minutes later. The older man looked up. For several moments neither spoke. Then Richard surprised him. You handled that well. Ethan blinked. Thank you. Richard nodded slowly. Another silence followed. Then the older man asked a question, one that carried enormous weight. Do you care about my daughter? The room suddenly felt much smaller. Ethan wasn't prepared for that. Not at all, because there was no safe answer. If he said yes, it implied emotions he wasn't ready to discuss. If he said no, it would be a lie. A dangerous lie. Eventually, he settled on honesty. I care about her. Richard studied him carefully. Searching for deception, finding none. The older man nodded once. A small nod, yet somehow it felt significant. Very significant. Later that evening, Isabella found her father alone in his office. The conversation began unexpectedly. Dad. Richard looked up. You were right. The statement shocked her. Her father almost never admitted that. About what? Victor. A bitter smile crossed his face. I saw what I wanted to see. The admission sounded painful, because it was. Richard had trusted Victor, supported him, welcomed him into the family, and he'd been wrong. Very wrong. He fooled all of us. Not all of us. Richard looked toward the window, then smiled slightly. Ethan never liked him. That surprised her. What? Richard nodded. I noticed years ago. He was always respectful, always professional. But whenever Victor visited Ball, the older man shrugged. Ethan watched him. The realization fascinated her, because it sounded exactly like Ethan. Quiet observation. Careful judgment. No unnecessary drama. Why didn't he say anything? Richard actually laughed, because nobody asked. Oh, again. That answer. The answer that seemed to define Ethan's entire existence. The following week brought additional complications. Several members of the extended family publicly criticized the marriage. Interviews appeared. Articles followed. Comments spread through social circles. The pressure increased. Yet something unexpected happened. For every criticism, support appeared too. Employees defended Ethan. Community members defended Ethan. Former colleagues defended Ethan. Even some investors began speaking positively about him. The divide became obvious. People who actually knew Ethan respected him. People who didn't know him judged him. The pattern repeated constantly. And eventually even the media began noticing. One television commentator summarized it perfectly. Everyone with an opinion seems divided into two groups. The people who've met Ethan Cole, and the people who haven't. The observation went viral. For good reason. Because it was true. Across town, Victor watched the segment from his penthouse and hated every second. Nothing was working. The family pressure hadn't worked. The public criticism hadn't worked. The social attacks hadn't worked. Every attempt seemed to produce the opposite result. The harder Ethan was pushed, the more people respected him. Victor threw the remote across the room. The device shattered against a wall. His patience was running out. fast. Because while public opinion remained divided, one thing was becoming increasingly clear. Isabella's feelings were changing. Victor could see it. The family could see it. Even strangers could see it. The way she defended Ethan. The way she smiled around him. The way she looked at him. Those weren't the actions of a woman trapped in a revenge marriage anymore. They were the actions of someone falling in love, and if that process continued, Victor would lose any chance of reclaiming control. Which meant the next attack couldn't simply damage Ethan. It had to destroy him. Completely. Permanently. Inside his desk drawer sat the forged financial evidence. Prepared. Ready. Waiting. Victor opened the folder slowly. A cold smile appeared, because the final phase was about to begin. And unlike everything that came before, this attack wouldn't target opinions. It would target freedom. And if Victor succeeded, Ethan Cole wouldn't just lose his reputation. He could lose everything. The knock came at 6:30 in the morning. Sharp. Loud. Unexpected. Ethan was already awake. Years of early schedules had made sleeping late nearly impossible. He was halfway through making coffee when the sound echoed through the mansion again. A second knock, more aggressive this time. His instincts immediately told him something was wrong. Very wrong. Across the hall, Isabella opened her bedroom door. Still wearing a robe. Still half asleep. Their eyes met. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Both felt it. Trouble. A moment later, hurried footsteps echoed through the mansion. One of the staff members appeared. Pale. Nervous. Mr. Cole. The employee swallowed hard. There are police officers at the front gate. Silence. Complete silence. Isabella's stomach dropped. Ethan's expression remained calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that appeared when someone was mentally preparing for impact. Within minutes, the mansion's main entrance had become a scene of chaos. Police vehicles lined the driveway. Investigators stood near the gates. Several reporters had somehow already arrived. Cameras pointed toward the estate. Waiting. Watching. Hunting. The timing felt suspiciously perfect. Because it was. Richard Hart arrived from upstairs moments later. Furious. Absolutely furious. What is this? A senior investigator stepped forward. Professional. Polite. Uncomfortable. We have a warrant. The words hit like a hammer. A warrant. Isabella felt her heart begin racing. For what? The answer arrived immediately. Financial fraud. The world seemed to stop. Not because anyone believed it. Because the accusation had become real. Public accusations were one thing. Police investigations were another. The investigator continued. Mr. Ethan Cole is being asked to cooperate regarding an ongoing financial inquiry. The mansion fell silent. Several staff members looked horrified. Others appeared confused. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then Ethan stepped forward. What exactly am I accused of? The investigator handed him a document. Ethan reviewed it carefully. His expression never changed. Not once. The accusations matched the forged records Victor had created. Suspicious transactions. Unauthorized transfers. Financial manipulation. The entire fabricated story. Only now it carried legal weight. The investigator shifted uncomfortably. We aren't making conclusions. We're following evidence. Richard almost laughed. A dangerous laugh. The evidence is fake. We understand your position. No. Richard stepped closer, his voice becoming colder. You don't understand anything. The investigator wisely remained silent, because arguing with Richard Hart before sunrise seemed like a terrible life decision. Meanwhile, Isabella couldn't stop staring at Ethan, waiting. Watching. Looking for fear. Panic. Anything. Instead, she found something unexpected. Disappointment. Not fear. Disappointment. As though he'd expected better. As though he'd hoped people would be smarter than this. The realization broke her heart slightly. Because nobody should become accustomed to being attacked. Yet Ethan clearly had. Eventually the investigator spoke again. We need you to come with us. The sentence felt surreal. Unreal. Impossible. Yet there it was. Ethan nodded once. Okay. No po. The answer came instantly. From Isabella. Everyone turned toward her. Knew. She stepped forward. This is insane. The investigator remained professional. Miss Hart. Mrs. Cole. The correction came automatically now, and somehow it sounded more natural than ever. The investigator continued carefully. Mrs. Cole. This is procedure. Numbu. Her voice sharpened. This is someone using forged evidence. Several reporters outside the gates zoomed in immediately, capturing every second, every expression, every word. The nightmare was becoming public. Exactly as Victor intended. Fortunately, Ethan intervened before things escalated. It's okay. It is not okay. He looked toward her. A calm look. A steady look. The same look that had grounded her countless times over the past months. They have a job to do. The statement frustrated her, because it was reasonable. And she hated reasonable in moments like this. 30 minutes later, Ethan left the mansion alongside investigators. Not under arrest. Not in handcuffs. But the distinction barely mattered to the media. The headlines appeared within minutes. Police investigate billionaire's husband. Fraud inquiry targets Ethan Cole. Scandal deepens around Hart family marriage. Every news channel carried the story. Every website pushed notifications. Every social media platform exploded. Across the city, Victor watched everything unfold from his penthouse and smiled. For the first time in months, the trap was working. Finally, beautifully, perfectly, public opinion shifted immediately. Some supporters remained loyal. Others began questioning everything. Doubt spread faster than facts ever could. Victor understood that principle well. People remembered accusations, not corrections. Even if Ethan eventually proved innocent, the damage would linger. That was the beauty of the strategy. At Hart Industries, investors panicked. Board members demanded updates. Reporters surrounded company headquarters. The crisis consumed everything. By noon, emergency meetings had begun. By evening, the company's stock had dropped noticeably. Nothing catastrophic, yet, but enough to create concern. Enough to create pressure. Inside the mansion, Isabella refused to sit still. She called attorneys, investigators, executives, anyone who might help. Every answer sounded the same. We're working on it. She hated those words, because they meant waiting, and waiting felt unbearable. Late that afternoon, Richard entered her office. His expression looked darker than she'd ever seen. How bad is it? The question sounded simple. The answer wasn't. The documents are sophisticated. Richard sat heavily. Professional. Meaning whoever created them knew exactly what they were doing. The realization chilled both of them. Because random attacks didn't look like this. Random attacks weren't this detailed. This was planned. Carefully. Patiently. Intentionally. Richard looked toward the window. Victor. The name hung in the room. Neither needed further explanation. The motive existed. The resources existed. The timing existed. Everything pointed toward him. The challenge remained proving it. Hours later, Isabella finally received a call. Ethan. The moment she heard his voice, relief washed through her. Are you okay? I'm fine. The answer sounded genuine, which somehow made her emotional. Because she wasn't fine. Not even close. They questioned me all day. What happened? They found inconsistencies. Hope appeared instantly. Inconsistencies. The documents don't make sense. A small smile appeared on her face. Good. Very done. The truth was beginning to fight back. They know something is wrong. The words eased her fears slightly. Not completely. But enough. For now. The call lasted nearly an hour. Mostly because neither wanted to hang up. Neither mentioned that fact. Yet both understood it. When the conversation finally ended, Isabella sat quietly for several minutes, thinking. Reflecting. Remembering. Then something occurred to her. Victor had spent months trying to destroy Ethan. Social pressure. Media attacks. Rumors. Public humiliation. Now legal accusations. Every strategy shared one common element. obsession. The realization felt important, because people didn't invest that much energy into someone they didn't fear. Victor was afraid, genuinely afraid, and that meant Ethan represented something dangerous, something powerful, a threat. The next morning confirmed it. One of Hart Industries' private investigators arrived with new information. Interesting information. Potentially explosive information. The investigator placed several photographs on Richard's desk. Images from parking garages, restaurants, office buildings, different locations, different dates. One thing remained consistent: Victor, and a man connected to the forged financial records. The room became silent, very silent, because the implications were enormous. The evidence wasn't enough yet, not for court, not for public exposure. But it was a start, the first crack in Victor's plan, the first sign that the trap might eventually collapse. Richard looked toward Isabella, then smiled, a dangerous smile, the kind powerful men reserved for enemies. "I think we just found our first thread." Across town, completely unaware that his scheme was beginning to unravel, Victor celebrated. Champagne, business calls, quiet confidence. He believed he was winning, believed Ethan was trapped, believed the pressure would eventually break him. Victor had made one critical mistake, a mistake he wouldn't discover until much later. He underestimated how fiercely Isabella would fight for Ethan, because somewhere along the way, the marriage had changed. The revenge had faded. The partnership had grown. And whether Isabella was ready to admit it or not, this wasn't just about protecting her husband anymore. It was about protecting the man she loved. For the first time since the scandal began, Isabella felt something other than fear. Purpose. A clear, focused purpose. For weeks she had been reacting, responding, defending, trying to keep up with attacks coming from every direction. Now that had changed. Now she had a target. Victor. The photographs connecting him to the forged financial records weren't enough to destroy him. Not yet. But they were enough to start pulling the thread, and Isabella intended to pull hard. Very hard. The following morning, Hart Manor transformed into something resembling a private investigation headquarters. Attorneys arrived. Investigators arrived. Technology specialists arrived. Every available resource began focusing on one objective. Victor was responsible. Richard personally took control of the operation, which immediately terrified everyone involved. Because Richard Hart approached problems the same way he built his fortune. Relentlessly. The older man stood before a conference table covered with reports, photographs, financial documents, timelines, connections, patterns. Months of hidden activity were finally being examined properly. This wasn't random. Richard pointed toward a timeline. It was planned. Several investigators nodded. The evidence supported that conclusion. Every attack had escalated. Rumors, media stories, business pressure, then criminal accusations. Each stage carefully designed, carefully timed, carefully executed. Someone had invested enormous effort into destroying Ethan, and all roads kept leading back to Victor. Across the room, Isabella studied one photograph closely. Victor leaving a restaurant, the same restaurant visited repeatedly by one of the financial consultants linked to the forged documents. At first glance it meant nothing. Look deeper and the pattern became impossible to ignore. He got sloppy. One investigator smiled. Ego usually does that. The observation felt accurate. Victor had become increasingly emotional, increasingly desperate, and desperate people made mistakes. Meanwhile, Ethan remained strangely calm, almost suspiciously calm. He sat reviewing evidence while everyone else operated in crisis mode. Eventually, Isabella noticed. "Why are you so relaxed?" Ethan looked up. "I'm not relaxed." "You look relaxed." "I've just accepted reality." The answer confused her. "What does that mean?" He leaned back thoughtfully. "It means I can't control accusations. I can't control rumors. I can't control what Victor does." A small shrug followed. But I can control how I respond. Again, that calm perspective, that irritatingly reasonable perspective. She wanted to argue. Unfortunately, he was right. The realization didn't make it less annoying. Later that afternoon, a breakthrough arrived. A significant breakthrough. One of Hart Industries' investigators uncovered financial transfers between Victor and a private consulting company. The same consulting company linked to several forged records. The room immediately became electric. Excitement spread rapidly. Because this wasn't coincidence anymore. This was connection. Direct connection. Richard reviewed the documents carefully, then reviewed them again. Finally, he looked toward the investigative team. Verify everything. The order came instantly. No assumptions. No shortcuts. If we move against Victor, we do it perfectly. Everyone understood. One mistake could destroy the entire case. Precision mattered. Patience mattered. Facts mattered. The next 48 hours became a blur of activity. Investigators interviewed former employees. Attorneys reviewed records. Financial experts traced transactions. Piece by piece, the puzzle began forming. And the picture wasn't pretty. Several individuals connected to Victor appeared repeatedly. Consultants, lawyers, public relations specialists, media contacts. The network extended further than anyone expected. Far further. By Friday evening, Isabella sat with Ethan in the mansion library reviewing the latest findings. The room had become their unofficial headquarters. A place where strategy replaced panic. A place where conversations became honest. The transformation felt strange. Months ago they barely knew each other. Now they spent hours together every day, working, talking, trusting. The thought made her smile. What? Ethan noticed immediately. She shook her head. Nothing. Liar. The accusation made her laugh. You're getting bold. I'm getting observant. That's dangerous. His smile widened slightly. So I've heard. For several moments neither returned to the documents. Neither seemed particularly interested. The silence felt comfortable. Natural. Something neither had expected when this marriage began. Eventually Isabella looked toward him. Thank you. The statement surprised him. For what? For staying. The answer came quietly. Honestly, without preparation. The smile disappeared. A more serious expression replaced it. You don't have to thank me. I do. She looked down at the papers. When all of this started, her voice softened. I didn't exactly give you a choice. The memory made them both smile. The proposal. The chaos. The madness. It all felt strangely distant now. You gave me a choice. Ethan corrected gently. Just not a particularly good one. That earned another laugh. Then the mood shifted again, becoming quieter, more thoughtful. Eventually Ethan spoke. You know something? What? If I could go back. He stopped, thinking carefully. If I could go back to that night. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air heavier. Neither fully understood why. What? A small smile appeared. I'd still say yes. Silence. Complete silence. Neither moved. Neither looked away. The statement carried more weight than either wanted to acknowledge. Because it wasn't about revenge anymore. Not really. Maybe it hadn't been for a while. A knock interrupted the moment. Both immediately looked away. The timing felt almost comical. Richard entered carrying several folders. Business mode returned instantly. Unfortunately, we found it. The room froze. Every emotion vanished. Every distraction disappeared. What? Richard dropped the folders onto the table. Evidence. Real evidence. Powerful evidence. Financial records. Communications. Payment trails. Everything connecting Victor to the operation. Not enough to guarantee victory, but enough to launch a serious counterattack. The room suddenly felt alive again. Energy returned. Momentum returned. Hope returned. For the first time since the scandal began, victory seemed possible. Realistically possible. The following week moved quickly. Attorneys prepared legal actions. Investigators continued gathering evidence. Journalists quietly received information. The machine began turning. Slowly, carefully, deliberately, and Victor remained completely unaware. Across town, he celebrated. The fraud investigation remained active. Media coverage continued. Public uncertainty persisted. From his perspective, everything was working. The trap remained intact. The pressure remained effective. The pressure remained inevitable. His confidence grew daily. That confidence would become his biggest mistake. Because while Victor focused on destroying Ethan, he failed to notice something important. Someone was building a case against him. A powerful case. A dangerous case. And by the time he realized it existed, it might already be too late. That evening, Isabella stood alone on the mansion balcony. The city lights stretched endlessly across the horizon. Beautiful, peaceful, promising. Footsteps approached. Ethan, as always. He joined her quietly. No words necessary. For several moments they simply stood together, watching the skyline, sharing the silence. Then Ethan looked toward her. You seem happier. The observation surprised her, because it was true. Despite the investigation, despite the attacks, despite the uncertainty, she was happier. The realization felt strange, almost impossible. Then she understood why. For the first time in months, she wasn't facing everything alone, and somehow that made all the difference. As the night deepened around them, neither noticed how close they were standing. Neither mentioned it. Neither needed to. Because some truths no longer required words. And somewhere in the city, Victor Langford continued celebrating a victory that was already slipping away. He just didn't know it yet. The first sign came from Eleanor, which was unfortunate, because mothers notice things long before anyone else, and Eleanor Hart had spent weeks quietly observing, watching, analyzing, connecting pieces. By the time Isabella realized something was wrong, her mother had already reached a conclusion, a very dangerous conclusion. The confrontation occurred during breakfast. Eleanor entered the dining room carrying a cup of tea, sat down, studied her daughter for several seconds, then delivered the attack. You love him. Isabella nearly choked on her coffee. The reaction alone answered the question. Eleanor smiled. That obvious? No. Very obvious? No. Extremely obvious. Isabella groaned. This conversation is over. Interesting. Eleanor sipped her tea. That's usually what guilty people say. The conversation became increasingly unbearable, especially because part of Isabella knew her mother might be right. That was the real problem, not the accusation. The possibility. After Eleanor finally left, Isabella remained seated alone, thinking. Something she had been doing far too much lately. The truth was becoming difficult to avoid. She enjoyed spending time with Ethan. More than anyone else. She trusted him completely. More than anyone else. She respected him deeply. More than anyone else. The pattern seemed concerning. Very concerning. Because those feelings weren't supposed to exist. Not in a revenge marriage. Not in an arrangement that began with heartbreak and bad decisions. Yet here they were. Growing. Strengthening. Refusing to disappear. The realization followed her throughout the day. And into the evening. Unfortunately, Ethan was having similar problems, though he handled them with significantly less grace. Specifically, none. The issue began when one of the Hart Industries executives invited him to dinner. The gathering itself wasn't unusual. Several managers attended. A few investors. Some consultants. Normal business networking. Everything remained professional. Until someone asked a simple question. So when did you realize you were in love with Isabella? Ethan nearly dropped his glass. The entire table immediately noticed. Laughter followed. Lots of laughter. Unfortunately, nobody seemed interested in helping him. The executive responsible for the question grinned. That's not a denial. I didn't answer. Exactly. More laughter. Ethan suddenly missed board meetings. At least spreadsheets behaved rationally. People rarely did. The conversation continued. Mercilessly. Eventually, someone asked another dangerous question. If she wasn't rich, would you still have married her? The answer came instantly, without hesitation, without thought. Yes. The table became silent, because nobody expected such certainty, least of all Ethan. The realization hit him immediately afterward. He had answered too quickly. Far too quickly. Yet he couldn't take it back, because it was true. The truth settled heavily in his mind during the drive home, and remained there long after he arrived at the mansion. For the first time in months, he felt genuinely nervous. Not because of Victor. Not because of the investigation. Because of Isabella. Because feelings complicated everything, and those feelings were becoming impossible to ignore. The next morning brought an unexpected distraction. The investigation against Victor continued producing results. More evidence emerged. More connections appeared. The case grew stronger daily. Several attorneys now believed criminal charges were possible, potentially likely. The news should have dominated everyone's attention. Instead, Isabella found herself distracted. Dangerously distracted. By Ethan. Specifically, by how often she noticed him. The way he smiled. The way he listened. The way he always seemed to know when she needed support. The observations felt increasingly personal. Increasingly emotional. Increasingly problematic. Later that afternoon, they attended a charity event together, one of many public appearances required by their positions. Normally these events felt exhausting. This one felt different, perhaps because public opinion had begun shifting. Many people now supported Ethan openly. Others respected him professionally. The hostility remained, but it was fading, slowly, steadily. As the event continued, Isabella found herself watching Ethan interact with guests. The scene fascinated her. Children gravitated toward him. Volunteers trusted him. Employees liked him. Strangers seemed comfortable around him almost immediately. The effect appeared effortless, natural, authentic, and incredibly attractive. The final realization nearly made her panic. Attractive. The word echoed through her mind. Loudly. Repeatedly. Dangerously. Across the room, Ethan was experiencing problems of his own. Because every time he looked toward Isabella, he noticed something new. Her determination. Her intelligence. Her kindness. The way she fought for people she cared about. The way she refused to quit. The way she smiled when she forgot others were watching. All those observations created a problem. A significant problem. Because he wasn't supposed to notice those things. Not like this. Not anymore. The event ended shortly before sunset. On the drive home, neither spoke much. Both seemed distracted, lost in private thoughts. The silence felt different, not uncomfortable, just charged, as though both sensed something changing. Neither wanted to acknowledge it first. That evening, a thunderstorm rolled across the city. Heavy rain, strong winds, constant lightning. The weather knocked out power across several neighborhoods, including parts of the Hart estate. Generators activated quickly, but sections of the mansion remained dark. Isabella discovered this while attempting to locate several files in the library. Moments later, Ethan appeared carrying a flashlight. The timing felt suspiciously convenient. Looking for something. She laughed, apparently. Together they searched through shelves and cabinets. The situation should have been simple. Unfortunately, the storm created an atmosphere. Soft shadows. Flickering light, quiet isolation. The kind of atmosphere romantic movies abused constantly, which was deeply unfair. Because reality suddenly felt uncomfortably similar. At one point both reached for the same folder. Their hands touched briefly. A tiny moment. Meaningless. Insignificant, yet neither moved immediately. Neither looked away. The air seemed to disappear. For 1 second. 2. 3. Then a crash of thunder shattered the moment. Both stepped back instantly. The interruption felt absurdly disappointing. Neither commented. Neither acknowledged what almost happened. But the moment remained, burning quietly in their thoughts. Hours later, After the storm passed, Isabella sat alone in her bedroom, unable to sleep. Again, the pattern was becoming familiar. She replayed the evening repeatedly. The library. The conversation. The accidental touch. The way her heart reacted afterward. Every memory pointed toward the same conclusion. A conclusion she could no longer avoid. She was falling in love with Ethan. The realization felt terrifying, wonderful, exciting, complicated, all at once. Across the hall, Ethan sat awake in the guest suite, experiencing exactly the same problem. Different room, same conclusion. Because despite every logical reason to maintain distance, despite the unusual circumstances, despite the uncertainty surrounding their future, he had fallen in love with her. The truth settled quietly into the darkness. Neither confessed it. Neither shared it. Yet both now carried the same secret. A secret growing harder to hide every day. Meanwhile, across the city, Victor Langford received devastating news. The investigation had reached a critical stage. Evidence connected directly to several of his associates. Attorneys were becoming aggressive. Questions were increasing. The walls were closing in. For the first time in months, genuine fear entered his thoughts. Because his plan was failing. And worse than that, the marriage was succeeding. Not publicly. Personally. The exact outcome he had worked so hard to prevent. Victor stared at the city skyline through his penthouse windows, his expression darkening. Because if Ethan and Isabella truly loved each other, then everything Victor had done would become meaningless, and he refused to accept that. No matter what it cost. Victor Langford stopped sleeping. For nearly a week, he barely slept more than a few hours each night. The pressure was becoming unbearable. Investigators kept asking questions. Attorneys kept requesting documents. Journalists kept calling. Business partners were becoming nervous. And worst of all, people were beginning to doubt him. Victor hated many things. Being doubted ranked near the top of the list. For years he had controlled every situation. Every negotiation. Every relationship. Every public image. Now that control was slipping away. Fast. And there was nothing he hated more. Meanwhile, inside Hart Manor, the mood had changed completely. For the first time in months, optimism filled the estate. The investigation was progressing, the evidence was growing stronger, and Ethan's name was slowly being cleared. Not officially. Not yet. But the momentum had shifted. People could feel it. Even the media had begun asking different questions. Instead of focusing on Ethan's alleged fraud, reporters were now investigating who created the accusations. That change terrified Victor. Because once people started asking the right questions, the answers became dangerous. Very dangerous. The breakthrough arrived on a Wednesday afternoon. A former consultant from Victor's network agreed to cooperate. Nobody expected it. The man had spent years working quietly behind the scenes. Managing contracts, arranging financial transactions, cleaning up complicated situations. The perfect employee, until federal investigators approached him with evidence. Then everything changed, because loyalty had limits, and prison was an excellent reminder of those limits. The consultant talked. A lot. He provided emails, financial records, meeting schedules, communication logs. Months of hidden activity suddenly became visible, and every road led directly to Victor. By sunset, the legal team at Hart Manor knew something extraordinary. They had him. Not speculation. Not assumptions. Not theories. Proof. Actual proof. The atmosphere inside the mansion became electric. Attorneys rushed between offices. Phones rang constantly. Investigators reviewed evidence repeatedly. Everyone understood the significance. Years from now, people would point to this moment. The moment everything changed. Richard stood in the conference room reviewing the final report. His expression remained unreadable. Until he reached the final page. Then he smiled. A dangerous smile. The kind people rarely forgot. He's finished. The words felt almost unreal. After months of attacks, Months of pressure, months of uncertainty. Victory finally seemed possible. Real victory. Not survival. Not damage control, justice. That evening, Isabella found Ethan standing alone on the balcony overlooking the city. The sunset painted the skyline gold and orange. Beautiful. Peaceful. A sharp contrast to the emotional storm they'd endured. She walked beside him. Neither spoke immediately. The silence felt comfortable, as it often did now. Eventually, she handed him a folder. Ethan opened it. His eyes moved across the pages, then widened slightly. The consultant's testimony, the financial evidence, the communication records, the entire conspiracy, every piece connected, every lie exposed, every attack explained. For several moments, he simply stared at the documents. Then he laughed softly. The sound surprised her. What's funny? He shook his head. I spent months wondering why he hated me. A faint smile appeared. Turns out he was just afraid. The observation felt accurate, painfully accurate. Victor had attacked Ethan because he viewed him as a threat. Not because Ethan had done anything wrong, because Ethan represented something Victor couldn't control. The truth felt strangely satisfying. The next 48 hours became a blur. The legal team moved quickly. Extremely quickly. Once the evidence became overwhelming, hesitation disappeared. Formal complaints were filed. Investigations expanded. Journalists received carefully verified information. And then the dam finally broke. The first major news network aired the story Thursday evening. The headline appeared on screens across the country. Business executive linked to fraud scheme against rival. Within minutes, every other outlet followed. The story exploded. Absolutely exploded. Emails surfaced. Bank transfers surfaced. Witness testimony surfaced. Piece by piece, Victor's carefully constructed image collapsed. People watched in disbelief. The respected businessman. The successful entrepreneur. The future industry leader. All of it had been a performance. A mask. A lie. The public reaction was brutal. Investors withdrew support. Business partners abandoned him. Friends stopped answering calls. The same people who once praised him suddenly vanished. Victor experienced a lesson many powerful people eventually learn. Success attracts crowds. Failure reveals who actually cares. By Friday morning, his empire was falling apart. Meanwhile, Hart Industries held a press conference. The event attracted enormous attention. Reporters filled every seat. Camera crews lined every wall. The atmosphere felt electric. Everyone wanted answers. Everyone wanted reactions. Most importantly, everyone wanted to see Ethan. For months his name had been dragged through the mud. Now people wanted to hear from him directly. When Ethan stepped onto the stage beside Isabella and Richard, the room immediately became silent. Thousands watched online. Millions would watch later. The moment mattered. Richard spoke first. Briefly, professionally. Then, he stepped aside, allowing Ethan to address the audience. Ethan approached the podium slowly. For a moment, he simply looked at the crowd. The cameras, the reporters, the attention. None of it felt natural. Yet somehow he remained calm. The same calm that had carried him through everything. Finally, he spoke. I spent most of my life believing character eventually matters. The room became perfectly silent. So despite everything that's happened, he paused. I still believe that. No anger, no revenge, no bitterness. Just honesty. The simplicity of the statement hit harder than any dramatic speech could have. Because everyone knew what he'd endured. The attacks. The accusations. The humiliation. Yet he stood there without hatred. Without resentment. Without cruelty. The response was immediate. Applause filled the room. Real applause. Earned applause. The kind nobody could fake. Across the stage, Isabella felt her chest tighten. Not from sadness. Not from stress. From pride. Pure pride. The man standing beside her had every reason to be angry. Every reason to seek revenge. Yet he remained himself. Kind. Honest. Strong. The realization made it impossible to look away. Later that afternoon, another major development arrived. An arrest warrant was issued for several individuals connected to the fraud scheme. Victor's closest associates. The people who helped create the forged evidence. The people who carried out his orders. The news spread instantly. And everyone knew what came next. Victor. The question wasn't whether investigators would reach him. The question was when. Across the city, Victor sat alone inside his penthouse. The television displayed endless coverage of the scandal. His collapse, his humiliation. The irony felt unbearable. Months earlier he had watched similar coverage about Ethan. Certain he was winning. Certain he was untouchable. Now the situation had reversed completely. The realization filled him with rage and fear. Mostly fear. For the first time, he truly understood. The game was over. Back at Hart Manor, the mood felt almost celebratory. Staff members smiled more. Executives seemed relieved. Even Richard appeared happier. A rare and somewhat alarming sight. Yet despite the victory, Isabella couldn't stop thinking about something else. Someone else. Ethan. Because now that the crisis was ending, another question remained. A far more personal question. A far more important question. The revenge was complete. Victor had lost. The truth had won, which meant the original purpose of the marriage no longer existed. The realization arrived suddenly. And hit hard. Because if the revenge was over, what happened to them? The thought lingered throughout the evening. Refusing to leave. Growing heavier with every passing hour. And as the city celebrated Victor's downfall, Isabella realized she feared one thing more than losing to him. Losing Ethan. A possibility she wasn't prepared to face. Not now. Maybe not ever. The victory should have felt perfect. Instead, Isabella felt terrified. For months she had focused on a single objective. Survive. Fight back. Expose Victor. Protect Ethan. Every day had been filled with challenges, problems, threats, pressure. Now those things were disappearing. And with their disappearance came a question she could no longer avoid. What happened next? The answer frightened her more than she expected. Because the marriage had started with a purpose, a very specific purpose. Revenge. That purpose was gone, which meant the arrangement itself should technically be over. The realization followed her everywhere. Into meetings, into conversations, into sleepless nights. Especially sleepless nights. Meanwhile, Ethan was struggling with the exact same problem, though neither realized it. The days after Victor's public collapse felt strangely quiet. Too quiet. After months of chaos, normal life had returned. And normal life left room for thinking. Far too much thinking. One evening Ethan sat alone in the workshop behind the estate. The workshop had become his sanctuary. A place where engines made more sense than emotions. A place where problems could actually be fixed. Unfortunately, no wrench in the world could solve what was happening inside his head. The door opened. He didn't need to look up. He already knew who it was. Found you. Isabella's voice. Warm, familiar, dangerous. Because hearing it always improved his mood, a fact he was trying very hard not to examine. She walked deeper into the workshop, looking around. This was her first time visiting. Motorcycles stood throughout the space, some fully restored, others partially rebuilt. Tools lined the walls, parts covered workbenches. The place felt completely different from the rest of the mansion. More personal, more honest. This is impressive. Ethan smiled. Most people call it clutter. Most people are wrong. The answer made him laugh. For a few minutes she wandered through the workshop, examining different projects, asking questions, listening to explanations. The interaction felt effortless, natural, comfortable. Exactly the problem. Because neither wanted things to feel this natural. Not when difficult decisions waited ahead. Eventually Isabella stopped beside an unfinished motorcycle. What happens when it's finished? The question sounded innocent. Yet somehow it wasn't. Ethan understood immediately. Because he wasn't looking at the motorcycle anymore. He was looking at her. And both knew they weren't discussing machinery. The silence stretched. Long. Uncomfortable. Necessary. Finally, Ethan answered, "I suppose it starts a new chapter." The words lingered between them. A new chapter, exactly. And that was the problem. Neither knew what that chapter looked like. The following morning brought an unexpected complication. Richard requested a private meeting with Ethan. The invitation immediately made him nervous. Richard Hart didn't schedule private conversations for fun. When Ethan entered the office, the older man gestured toward a chair. "Sit." Never a comforting beginning. Ethan sat. Richard studied him for several moments, then got directly to the point. "Do you love my daughter?" The question hit harder than any business negotiation, harder than any accusation, harder than any scandal. Because there was no escape. No safe answer. No distraction. Just truth. For several seconds Ethan said nothing. Then he smiled faintly. A defeated smile. The kind people wore when pretending no longer seemed useful. "Yes." The answer came quietly, honestly, completely. Richard nodded slowly, as though he'd expected it. "Good." Ethan blinked. "What?" "Good." The older man leaned back. "I was worried you were blind." The statement caught him completely off guard. For the first time in months, Ethan genuinely didn't know what to say. Richard actually smiled. A rare event. Potentially historic. Then the older man became serious again. Now the important question. Ethan braced himself. "Does she know?" The answer arrived immediately. "No." Richard sighed. "That sounds about right." Meanwhile, across the mansion, Eleanor was conducting a remarkably similar conversation. Unfortunately for Isabella, because Eleanor possessed the subtlety of a guided missile when she wanted answers. "You love him?" Again. The statement. Not a question. A statement. Isabella groaned. "We've discussed this." "No." Eleanor shook her head. "You've avoided discussing this." Which was technically true. Deeply annoying, but true. Her mother continued. "Let me ask something simpler." "Please don't." Ignoring the request completely, Eleanor smiled. "If Ethan left tomorrow, how would you feel?" The answer appeared instantly. Too instantly. Like panic, like fear, like loss. The realization hit before she could stop it. And judging by Eleanor's expression, her mother saw it too. "Oh." The older woman smiled softly. "Oh dear." The conversation ended shortly afterward. Because Isabella fled. Literally fled. Which probably wasn't the strongest legal defense against emotional self-awareness. That evening, she found herself sitting alone in the mansion library. The same library where everything began. The proposal. The madness. The impossible decision. Looking back, it all seemed surreal. She had been angry, heartbroken, determined. And somehow, through all that chaos, she'd stumbled into something unexpected. Something real. The realization felt overwhelming. A quiet sound interrupted her thoughts. Footsteps. Ethan. Of course, the universe apparently enjoyed irony. He entered carrying several files. Then stopped, immediately noticing her expression. "You okay?" There it was. The question he always asked. The question he genuinely cared about. The question nobody else seemed to ask the same way. She looked at him. Really looked at him. And suddenly the answer became obvious. Painfully obvious. The reason she felt safe around him. The reason she trusted him. The reason she smiled more. The reason she couldn't imagine losing him. It wasn't complicated. It wasn't confusing. It was love. Simple. Terrifying. Wonderful love. Unfortunately, saying that aloud remained significantly harder. "Isabella." His voice pulled her back. She blinked, realizing she'd been staring. "Sorry." He smiled. "For what?" Good question. She didn't know. The conversation remained light afterward. Comfortable. Familiar. Yet something had changed. Both felt it. Neither acknowledged it. The tension wasn't unpleasant. Just unfinished. Like a sentence waiting for its final word. Across the city, Victor Langford packed boxes. The contrast felt almost absurd. Months earlier he controlled millions. Now he was preparing to leave the penthouse. Several business assets had been frozen. Investigations continued. Former allies had disappeared. The empire was gone. And as he packed the final box, one thought repeated endlessly. Ethan won. Not the scandal, not the investigation, the bigger battle, the important battle. He'd won Isabella. The realization hurt more than losing money ever could. Back at Hart Manor, night settled across the estate. Most lights had gone dark. Most conversations had ended. Yet two people remained awake. One in a library. One in a guest suite, thinking about the same thing. Feeling the same thing. Fearing the same thing. Because love had arrived quietly. Unexpectedly. Without permission. And now neither knew what to do with it. Only one truth remained clear. The revenge was over. The marriage was no longer fake. The question now wasn't whether they loved each other. The question was who would be brave enough to say it first. The opportunity arrived on a Monday morning. Completely unexpected. Completely life-changing. And completely inconvenient. Because life seemed to enjoy terrible timing. Ethan was reviewing reports in the study when his phone rang. The number looked unfamiliar. Normally he would have ignored it. Something made him answer. 5 minutes later he was staring silently at the wall, trying to process what he'd just heard. Across the room, Isabella immediately noticed. What happened? Ethan looked up. For several seconds he couldn't find the words. Then he laughed. Not because anything was funny. Because sometimes shock looked like laughter. I don't know. That answer immediately concerned her. You don't know what? He handed her the phone. An email remained open on the screen. She read it once, then again, then a third time. Her eyes widened. You're serious? Apparently. The email came from one of the most respected investment groups in the country, a group known for funding promising entrepreneurs and business leaders, people who built companies, people who created industries, people who changed markets. And they wanted to meet Ethan, specifically Ethan. Not Hart Industries. Not Richard Hart. Not Isabella. Him? The reason was surprisingly simple. Over the past several months, word had spread. Board meetings, strategic decisions, crisis management. Several executives had spoken privately about Ethan's abilities. One recommendation led to another, then another, until eventually the right people noticed. Now they wanted to discuss something extraordinary. An opportunity to build his own company. The dream he'd abandoned years ago. The dream he'd sacrificed. The dream he'd convinced himself was gone forever. Suddenly it wasn't. For several moments neither spoke. The reality felt overwhelming. Then Isabella smiled. A genuine smile. One filled with excitement. I'm proud of you. The words landed harder than she expected. Because Ethan believed her. Completely. And somehow that mattered more than the opportunity itself. Unfortunately, the excitement created a new problem. A very serious problem. If Ethan accepted the offer, everything would change. Again. The meeting took place 3 days later, inside a glass tower overlooking the city skyline. The investment group occupied several floors. Elegant, professional, intimidating. Exactly the sort of place Ethan once dreamed of entering, and exactly the sort of place he'd spent years assuming was no longer meant for him. Now he sat across from 6 investors, discussing ideas, strategies, markets, growth plans. The conversation lasted nearly 4 hours. When it ended, the investors looked impressed, very impressed. One of them finally leaned forward. I have a question. Ethan nodded. Of course. The investor smiled. Why haven't you done this already? The question felt almost unfair, because the answer wasn't simple. Life, responsibility, sacrifice, circumstances, thousands of reasons. Yet Ethan eventually settled on one. I was busy taking care of other people. The room became silent. Then one investor nodded slowly. Fair answer. A week later, the official proposal arrived. Funding, resources, partnership opportunities, everything necessary to launch a company, everything necessary to build the future he'd once imagined. everything necessary to leave Hart Industries behind. And that was the problem. The realization hit Isabella immediately, because while everyone celebrated the opportunity, she saw something else. Distance, change, the possibility of losing him, not permanently, but differently. The thought unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. Over the following days, Ethan became increasingly busy. Meetings, planning sessions, investor calls, legal consultations. The pace accelerated quickly, exactly as successful opportunities often did. And with every passing day, Isabella felt something she hated. Jealousy, not of the opportunity, of the future. Because the future suddenly seemed uncertain again. One evening she stood on the balcony watching city lights shimmer below. Lost in thought, the sound of footsteps interrupted her. Ethan, as always. Somehow always. You've been quiet. She smiled faintly. So have you. He joined her at the railing. The familiar silence settled comfortably between them. Yet this time something felt different. Heavier, more emotional. Eventually Ethan spoke. I might take it. The words hurt more than they should have. Not because she disagreed, because she agreed completely. You should? He looked toward her. You mean that? Of course. She forced a smile. It's everything you've worked for, everything you'd sacrificed for, everything you deserve. The words remained unspoken, yet both understood them. For several moments neither spoke. Then Ethan surprised her. You know what's strange? What? He smiled softly. 10 years ago I would have accepted immediately. The answer caught her attention. And now? The smile faded slightly. Now I'm thinking about what I'd leave behind. The statement lingered. Dangerously. Because neither wanted to examine it too closely. The next few days passed quickly. Preparations continued. Meetings multiplied. Opportunities expanded. The future approached faster than either expected. Then Richard Hart requested another private conversation. This time with Isabella. The older man found her in the office reviewing reports. Or pretending to. Because she had reread the same page 6 times. Richard immediately noticed. You love him. Apparently subtlety had died within the Hart family. Completely. She sighed. Eyes everyone determined to attack me. Richard actually laughed. Only because you're making this harder than necessary. The statement annoyed her. Mostly because it was true. Her father sat down. Then became serious. Do you know what my biggest mistake was? The question surprised her. Victor. No. The answer came instantly. Not trusting my instincts. He looked toward the window. I kept convincing myself appearances mattered. Wealth, status, connections. His expression softened, when character mattered more. Silence followed. Then he smiled slightly. I won't make that mistake again. The conversation stayed with Isabella long after he left. Because her father rarely spoke emotionally. When he did, people listened. Later that night, she found herself standing outside Ethan's workshop, watching through the window. He was working on a motorcycle, focused, relaxed, happy. The sight made her smile, then hurt, because she suddenly realized something. The opportunity wasn't taking him away. Fear was. Her fear. Fear of saying what she felt. Fear of changing things. Fear of vulnerability. The realization hit hard. And once it arrived, it refused to leave. Inside the workshop, Ethan noticed her reflection in the glass. Their eyes met. Neither looked away. For a brief moment, neither moved. Then he opened the door. You can come in? She laughed softly. I know. Neither mentioned the obvious. Neither mentioned the feelings. Yet both knew time was running out. Because opportunities didn't wait forever. And neither did people. Across the city, Victor Langford sat in a much smaller apartment than he once occupied. The contrast felt almost poetic. The investigations continued. The legal troubles remained. The future looked uncertain. And for the first time in years, he had nothing to control, nothing to manipulate, nothing to destroy, only consequences. As he stared out the window, One realization finally settled over him. He had lost everything trying to ruin Ethan. Everything. And Ethan had gained exactly what Victor never understood. Respect. Trust. Love. Back at Hart Manor, the future approached rapidly. The business opportunity. The unanswered feelings. The unfinished conversation. Everything was moving toward a conclusion. And deep down, both Ethan and Isabella knew it. Because some moments change lives, and one of those moments was coming. Very soon. The opportunity deadline arrived on Friday. 3 days. That was all Ethan had left. 3 days to decide whether he would accept the investment offer. 3 days to decide whether he would finally pursue the dream he'd sacrificed years ago. 3 days before everything changed. The timing felt impossible. Because there was another decision waiting. A much more personal one. A much more important one. And neither Ethan nor Isabella could avoid it any longer. For weeks they had danced around the truth, avoided conversations, ignored obvious feelings, pretended uncertainty still existed. It didn't. The uncertainty was gone. Only fear remained. Fear of saying the wrong thing. Fear of risking something precious. Fear of discovering the feelings weren't shared. The irony was almost painful. Two intelligent people, both in love, both convinced they might lose the other. The situation would have been funny if it weren't so frustrating. Saturday evening brought the annual Hart Foundation celebration, the same event where Ethan had once received recognition, the same event where society had mocked him, the same event where everything began changing. This year felt different, very different. Nearly every major figure in the city attended. Business leaders, investors, political figures, community leaders, media personalities. The ballroom glittered beneath crystal chandeliers, elegant, sophisticated, beautiful. Yet Isabella barely noticed, because she couldn't stop thinking about Ethan. Across the room, Ethan wasn't having much success either. Every conversation felt distracting. Every handshake felt unimportant. Every speech felt unnecessary, because one thought dominated everything. Tonight, the realization arrived repeatedly. Tonight, something had to happen. Eventually, the celebration moved toward its final portion. Awards, recognition, closing remarks, the usual traditions. Richard Hart stepped onto the stage. The room immediately became quiet. Everyone respected Richard. Some feared him. Most did both. The older man adjusted the microphone, then smiled. A surprisingly warm smile. Before we conclude tonight's celebration, he paused. I'd like to recognize someone. Several guests exchanged curious glances. This wasn't on the schedule, which immediately made it interesting. Richard continued. A year ago, I believed success could be measured through money. A faint laugh spread through the audience. Because everyone knew Richard possessed quite a lot of money. The older man smiled. I was wrong. The room became noticeably quieter. Because Richard Hart rarely admitted mistakes. When he did, people paid attention. I spent years evaluating people based on status, connections, appearances. He paused, then looked directly toward Ethan. And I nearly overlooked one of the finest men I've ever known. The ballroom became completely silent. Hundreds of eyes toward Ethan, toward Isabella, toward the obvious target of the speech. Richard continued. Ethan Cole taught me something important. Character matters. Integrity matters. Loyalty matters. The older man's voice grew slightly emotional. A rare event. A very rare event. And if I had a son, he paused, then smiled. I'd hope he turned out exactly like him. The room exploded into applause. Real applause. Powerful applause. The kind that comes from genuine respect. Ethan sat frozen, completely frozen, because nothing could have prepared him for that. Nothing. Across the ballroom, Isabella felt tears threatening to appear. Not sadness. Pride. Pure pride. Because every word was true. Every single one. The applause continued for nearly a minute. Then Richard smiled again and delivered one final surprise. Ethan. The room became quiet. Come up here. The request sounded simple, yet somehow monumental. Slowly, Ethan stood, then walked toward the stage. The applause resumed immediately. Louder this time. Stronger. Earned. As Ethan reached the stage, Richard shook his hand, then stepped aside, leaving him alone at the microphone. The situation felt absurd. Thousands of eyes, hundreds of guests, complete silence, waiting, expecting. Ethan looked toward the audience, then toward Isabella, and suddenly everything became clear. Painfully clear, wonderfully clear, because there would never be a better moment. Never. The opportunity, the future, the marriage, everything led here. To this decision, to this truth. He took a breath, then spoke. A year ago. His voice remained steady. A year ago, the most unexpected thing in my life happened. Soft laughter spread through the ballroom. Everyone knew the story. Everyone knew the wedding. Everyone knew the headlines. The impossible marriage. Ethan smiled slightly. What started as an act of revenge became something else. The room grew quiet again, very quiet, because everyone sensed where this was going, including Isabella, whose heart was suddenly beating far too fast. Ethan looked directly at her, not the audience, not the cameras, only her. And for the first time, every wall disappeared. Every hesitation, every fear, every excuse. Gone. Completely gone. Isabella. The sound of her name filled the ballroom, softly, honestly, beautifully. You changed my life. Silence. Absolute silence. Several guests were already crying. Eleanor definitely was. Richard looked suspiciously emotional. The situation was becoming dangerous. Ethan continued. You believed in me when I stopped believing in myself. His voice softened. You fought for me. You trusted me. You saw something in me that I couldn't see anymore. The ballroom disappeared. The crowd disappeared. Everything disappeared until only two people remained. Him and her. Then finally, the words. The words both had waited months to hear. I love you. The room erupted. Gasps. Cheers. Applause. Pure chaos. Yet Ethan heard none of it, because Isabella was already moving, crossing the ballroom, ignoring everyone, ignoring everything, straight toward him. By the time she reached the stage, tears were streaming down her face. Happy tears. The best kind. You idiot. The words emerged through laughter and tears. Ethan blinked. What? I've been waiting months for you to say that. The audience laughed. Loudly. Because apparently both of them had been ridiculous. For a very long time. Isabella stepped closer. Then closer still. You want to know something? Ethan smiled. What? She laughed through her tears. I love you too. The applause became deafening. Absolutely deafening. Richard finally surrendered and wiped his eyes. Eleanor openly cried. Several executives cheered. The investors looked delighted. The entire ballroom celebrated. And for the first time since their wedding, nothing felt complicated. Nothing felt uncertain. Nothing felt unfinished. Only truth remained. Several months later, Ethan officially launched his company. The investment group provided funding. Hart Industries became a strategic partner. The business grew quickly, not because of connections, not because of publicity, because Ethan was good at what he did. Very good. Meanwhile, Isabella continued leading Hart Industries, stronger than ever, smarter than ever, happier than ever. Together they built something unexpected. Not a revenge story, not a scandal, not a headline, a life. The following year, the Hart Foundation hosted another celebration. This time the atmosphere felt completely different. No scandals, no conspiracies, no betrayals, only celebration. As guests filled the ballroom, Ethan stood beside Isabella overlooking the crowd. The city lights shimmered beyond the windows. Beautiful, endless, hopeful. A reflection of everything ahead. Isabella smiled. Funny. What is? She looked toward him. The best decision I ever made started as a terrible idea. Ethan laughed. That's probably true. She squeezed his hand, then rested her head against his shoulder. Comfortable. Certain. Home. Because sometimes life doesn't give people what they expect. Sometimes it gives them something better. A betrayal became freedom. A revenge plan became a love story. A driver became a partner. A fake marriage became forever. And as the music played softly through the ballroom, Ethan and Isabella looked toward the future together. Not because it was perfect. Because it was theirs.